Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws. We're going today to do the penultimate book of the Spirit of the Laws, book in part six, book 30, which really focuses on the question of, let's see, let's get this a little bit. Yeah, okay, I can see. Yeah, there. Yeah. I can see more of me. Yeah, I can see a little more of me. Okay. You can make the picture smaller. Okay. So we're going to be looking at book 30, part six, this penultimate book. It deals, again, what he says here, the theory of feudal laws among the Franks in relation with the establishment of the monarchy. So again, the question of how a kind of a theory of feudal law, right, among the Frankish tribes. And the Franks are the Germanic tribes that in the monarchy that's shaped what is known as France. Okay, and their relation and this relationship of the Franks and the feudal system they created and the laws that they created because of it. How did it connect to the French monarchy? And this is the ancien regime in this sense. This is the classic understanding of this, right? This book has 25 chapters in it. Um, and the longest chapter is it's two. There's a couple of long ones in the middle, near the end, 17 in 19, 20 is even a little longish, and 12. The last is the last and the are similar in length, long like 11. So chapter 11 as well. So let's go look at this from the point of what is going on here. Again, the theory of the feudal laws among the Franks in relation to their monarchy, their monarchical regime. Um, uh, on chapter 1, on the feudal laws, I would believe there was an imperfection in my work if I did not mention an event which happened once in the world and which will perhaps never happen again if I did not speak of those laws which were seen to appear in a moment in all of Europe without the connection with those known until then, of those laws which did infinite good and ill, which left rights when domain was ceded, which diminished the whole of the weight of the lordship, uh, 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 the whole of the weight of the lordship by giving many people various kinds of lordships over the same thing or same persons, which set of various limits to empire that was too expansive, which produced with an inclination to anarchy and anarchy with a tendency to order and harmony. So therefore, what is he saying here? This is a thing. An event, something that happened, right? That 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 happened once. It probably won't happen again. He's saying, which did what? Which if I did not speak of those laws, which were seen to appear in a moment in all of Europe, feudal system. In other words, what happens? It's the collapse of an empire collapses, and out of it emerges, out of the remnants of it emerged this structure of competing order, right? That's what he says. Um, uh, uh, a connection with those known until then. In other words, without connection to previous. In other words, in Europe, without connection to all the political forms that came before it. In that sense, and of those laws which did infinite good and ill, infinite good and ill, right? Which left rights, which when domain ceded, which left rights even if the domain was ceded. In other words, the right certain privileges and certain things happened even when if the domain ceased to be. In other words, that this is that certain people, and with which diminish the whole of the weight of lordship by giving, in other words, the power lordship kind of became less powerful because too many people, various kinds of lordships, over the same thing or over the same person, jurisdictional issues and things like this, which set various limits to empire that was too extensive. In other words, the limits of empire. In other words, the Charlemagne's kingdom was more problematic than Roman Empire, right? Which produced rule with an inclination to anarchy and anarchy with an inclination to order and harmony. This would require a work expressly for this purpose. But given the nature of this one will find here these laws as I have come to view them rather than as I have dealt with them. So that was he's going to look at these feudal laws here, and he's going to look at the situation of this work would require a work expressly. In other words, he's basically saying, if I'm going to look at the question of the feudal world, I would have to do a work about this specifically. But I'm not going to do that. But given the nature of this one will find here these laws as I have come to view them rather than I have dealt with them. Okay, this is in other words, he hasn't really addressed them. He's going to how he sees them than how I have dealt with them. The spectacle of the feudal law is a fine one. It's an old oak tree. It is an old oak tree. And no, sorry. It's a fine one. An old oak tree stands. Now, this is not one. What is this about? Much. This is from Virgil, right? This is from Virgil's Aeneid. As much as the top reached to the heavens above, by so much did the roots tend to Tartus. So therefore, this is this metaphor. This an oak tree stands. Virgil, Aeneid. Right? What part? Its top. Its upper limbs and its top touches the heavens, but its roots go to the underworld. Right. So this is this metaphor of both very good and very ill. From afar, the eye sees. From afar, the eye sees its leaves. Coming close, it sees its trunk, but it does not perceive its roots. To find them, the ground must be dug up. So therefore, we want to understand the roots of things. We have to dig them to the ground. Yeah. The tree, you see the tree far away. We see the leaves. When we come look, we see the trunk, but we don't see the roots. And in order to do the roots, we have to dig up the ground. And this is the point. He's going to have to deconstruct. And this is the point. Any attempt to look at and this is what the feudal laws are. They're an oak tree. You have to understand. You want to find their origins. You have to go look at the roots. Right? What are the roots underneath them? Chapter 2 on the sources of the feudal laws. The people who conquered the Roman Empire were from Germany. Okay. Although few old authors describe their Moors for us, we have two great weights. In other words, Tacitus discovered the Moors and other German writers. Caesar, while waging war on the Germans, described the Moors of the Germans. Okay. This is Caesar, the Di Bello Gallico, the Gallic War. Sorry, and he regulated some of his enterprises by their Moors. He retreated from Germany, for instance, in the Gallic Wars. A few pages of Caesar on the subject are volumes. In other words, a few pages of this tells us huge amount about it. In other words, this, the Tacitus wrote a work expressly for that purpose on the Wars of the Germans. This work is short, but it is the work of Tacitus who summarized everything because he saw everything. So therefore, this is again praising Tacitus. Caesar and Tacitus, these are the two ancient authors. These two authors are in such agreement with the code of laws of the barbarian people that while reading Caesar and Tacitus, one finds these codes everywhere. And while reading these codes, one finds Caesar and Tacitus everywhere. For if in search of the feudal laws, I find myself in a dark labyrinth full of paths and detours, I believe that I hold the end of the thread and that I can walk. In other words, he's going to say, in other words, the origins, to understand this, you have to understand the origins of this is the Germanic peoples and their conquering of the Germanic tribes and Germanic peoples conquering the Roman Empire in the West. Okay? Caesar's the Roman conquest of Gaul, right? And what is he saying? He says, "In search of your laws, I'm in a labyrinth, right? I'm in this. That's going to be full of paths and detours." And if he says, I believe I hold at the end of the thread, the Germanic tribes, right? And maybe I can walk through it, follow that thread, he's saying, right? Chapter 3, the origin of vassalage. Caesar says that the Germans did not apply themselves to our culture. Most of them lived on milk, cheese, meat. No one had land or boundaries of his own. The princes and magistrates of each nation gave individuals the portion of land they wanted and in the place they wanted and obliged them to go elsewhere the next year. Right. This is from the Gallic War, Book XXX. In Tacit Germanica, they have neither house nor land nor employment, for they are supported by whomever they come upon. Right. Tacitus says that each prince has a troop of people who were attached to him and followed him. Again, Germanica 13, right? This author, who in his own language gives them a name relative to their state, calls their condition or state. He calls them companions, right? Companions. There was a singular emulation among them to obtain some distinction from the prince, and there was a like emulation among the princes for the number and bravery of their companions. Again, this is a Germanica again. It is as Tacitus adds Tacitus, rank. It is rank. It is power to be always surrounded by a crowd of young men one has chosen. It is an ornament in peace. It is a bulwark in war. If one surpasses the other in the number and courage of one's companions, one is famous in one's own nation and among the neighboring peoples. One receives presents. Embassies come from everywhere. Reputation often decides wars. In combat, it is shameful for the prince to be inferior in courage. It is shameful for the troops not to equal the valor of the prince. It is an eternal infamy to outlive him. One of the most sacred engagements is to defend him. If one city is in peace, the princes go to those that are waging war. In this war, they keep a great number. Of friends. The latter receives from them war horses and terrifying javelins. Meals, inelegant but large, are a kind of pay for them. Okay, the princes support his liberalities only by wars and rapine. So therefore, this is by liberality. You could persuade them to work the land and wait out the year far less than you could persuade them to challenge the enemy and be wounded. They will not. They will not acquire by sweat what they can obtain by blood. This is Tacitus, right? This is the idea of This idea of the Germanic tribal people. Again, this is. I mean, again, this is obviously the Indians, right? That is the reputation is by number of the warrior who has people following him, the young man was the leader who has other people who are companions with them to follow them. They will stay there and they fight with them. They'll die with them in that sense.
And why? It's he describes it. He says that these they they are paid by it's rapine and conquest and rapine rather than labor and work. Okay, thus among the Germans there were vassals but not fiefs. So companions, vassals. Vassals. The original vassalages was the companions, right? The companions who worked with you, died with you, you fed them, you gave them booty, but they weren't fiefs. There was you had a relationship, you had vassalage in this sense, the beginning of vassalage, but not land in that sense, no fiefs. So, there were no fiefs because the princes had no land to give, or rather, fiefs were war horses, weapons, and meals. So the original there were fiefs. There were. Oh, excuse me, I sneezed for a second. In other words, they weren't necessarily land. They were instead they were what? They were equipment like war horses, weapons, and meals. There were vassals because they were men faithful to whom were bound. They were faithful men who were bound by their word. Okay, this idea that I was bound by their word, their promise, who were engaged for war and who did almost the same service that was later done for fiefs. In other words, you had this idea that I'd done my obligation, I carried out my obligations for my prince, and therefore, the prince gave me something. Okay, okay, this is this idea. Chapter 7, continuation, same subject. Caesar, and this is from the Gallic Laws, Book 6 again, says that when one of the princes declared to an assembly that he had formed a plan for some expedition and asked for followers, those who approved the leader and the enterprise rose and offered their help. Right? So therefore, they had an assembly, they had a thing, therefore they asked for followers, and therefore those people who know the man and his enterprise would, you know, um, offered their help. They were praised by the multitude. But if they did not fulfill their engagement, they lost the confidence of the public and were regarded as deserters and traitors. What Caesar says here, and what we have said in the preceding chapter, following Tacitus, is the seed of the history of the reigns of the Merovingians, the early, the Merovingians in that sense, the king, the Frankish kings, right? This Frankish line of dynasty of kings. In other words, this is this idea of what? This they don't have land. They only have these powerful people who are brave and ambitious men who have plans to take and to conquer. They get and they had followers, and the followers were bound to them in kind of an obligation, right? It's companions, right? And this is the seed of the history of the reign of these kings. One must not be astonished that for each expedition the king should have had to remake new armies, persuade new troops, and engage new peoples. That they had to lay out much in order to acquire much. That they had acquired constantly by the division of lands and spoils. That they constantly gave away these lands and spoils. That their domain grew continually and diminished constantly. That a father who gave one of his children a kingdom always united it with a treasury. Uh, in other words, 9. This is that line, right? This give a kingdom and then therefore a treasury. That the treasury of a king was regarded as necessary to a monarchy, and that a king could not, even for the dowry of his daughter, share it with outsiders without the consent of other kings. See Gregory of Tours on the marriage of Philip's daughter. Sheldrake sent embassies to him to say that he could give none of the towns of his father's kingdom to his daughter, none of his treasure, or any of his serfs, his horses, his knights, his trains of oxen, or anything else. Right? This is the difference of dowries. The pace of monarchy was set by springs that had that had always that had always to be rewound. So therefore, this again, his expedition. In other words, I have had to go conquer lands. My springs of this, my monarchy, was done through personal obligation. It was done through the fact that I gave you stuff. I conquered, and I get a plan to get something. I needed people to raise armies. I have to give them things to get them to raise for people to follow me. I have to reward them when we got it. We were successful, so we divide lands, constantly divide those lands and spoils. So therefore, they get new ones, acquired constantly by divisions of lands and spoil. They kept on requiring to do more. These grew and grew, right? Then and therefore when they gave their children things, they gave them what they attention. This tension, they gave them a monarch, they gave them a kingdom, and then money, the treasury, and they had to preserve it. He says that, right? The pace of monarchy was set by the springs that always had to be run. Chapter 5 on the conquest of the Franks. It is not true that the Franks, on entering Gaul, occupied all the lands of the country in order to make fiefs for them. In other words, they didn't do that because of this, right? They didn't occupy all the lands of the country in order to make fiefs. Some people have thought thus, because they have seen that near the end of the reign of the Carolinians, almost all the land had become fiefs, under fiefs, or dependencies of one or the other. But this had a particular case that will subsequently be explained. So it wasn't for that reason. They entered that land. They didn't do it. They didn't do it to create fiefs. They didn't conquer all the land to make fiefs. This will happen to it, but this wasn't the primary reason, right? The consequence was they had wanted to draw that in other words, the consequence they have wanted to draw that the barbarians made a general regulation establishing servitude to the land everywhere is no less false than the principle. Okay, so therefore, this is idea. This is servitude to the gleb, where Montesquieu speaks of enslaving of enclage de la gleb in 30b note 10b, right? In 10b book 30, right? Again, this is you talk about servitude of the land. Okay, was no less false than the principle. If at a time when fiefs were revocable, all the land of the kingdom had been fiefs, or dependencies of fiefs, and all the men of the kingdom had been vassals or serfs dependent on them, since the one who has the goods always has the power, the king, who would continually have to have had the disposition of the fiefs, that is, of the only property. One would one would have had a power as arbitrary as that of the sultan. This upsets all of history. So in other words, he's saying that this was not the case. In other words, if they had that, if this was simply the way that was, it would be at the power just like the serfs. In other words, if at a time when fiefs were revocable, all the lands of kingdoms had been fiefs and dependencies of fiefs, and all the men of the kingdom had been vassals or serfs, dependent on them. Since the one who had the goods has the power, right? These are my goods, and that have the power. Who would constantly have had the disposition of the fiefs? That is the only property, right? Would have had a power as arbitrary as that of that. This kind of destroys that argument, he says, right? Chapter 6 on the Goths, Burgundians, and Franks. Gaul was invaded by the Germanic nations. The Visigoths occupied Narbonne and almost all of the south. The Burgundians were established in the part to the east, and the Franks conquered almost all the rest. So, therefore, the Gaul, the invasions of Gaul, the Germanic invasions of Gaul, and that therefore the Visigoths occupied Narbonne and almost all the south, so Italy and like that.
uh, um, um, the Burgundians established in the east, right? And the Franks conquered most of the rest. But there must be no doubt that during their conquest, these barbarians preserved the Moors' inclination and usages they had in their own country, because a nation does not change its way of thinking and acting in an instant. So therefore, they brought with them their own habits, their mores, and their things. In other words, they brought in their preserved their mores, have inclinations and usages. Their mores, inclinations, and usages came with them. That's it. In Germany, these people cultivated the land but little. It appears, according to Tacitus and Caesar, that they applied themselves earnestly to pastoral life. So it wasn't necessarily the farming, agriculturally. They were pastoral people, pasture, in the sense that livestock, animals, and that stuff. Thus, almost all the provisions of the law codes of the barbarians concern herds. Warracan, who wrote a history among the Franks, was a herdman. So therefore, this is the idea of the Frankish people. Now, this is interesting. His argument here is that the Franks were not agrarian; they were not necessarily people who they were concerned with herds. Okay, again, it sounds like the American Indians in that sense, right? This is maybe why the Germans had a fascination with the American Indians as much as they did, because if you look at the history origins of the similar aspects of this. Chapter 7: Different ways of dividing the land. So this is the way you divide lands. As the various pretexts, the Goths and the Burgundians had entered the interior of the empire, the Romans were obliged to provide for their sustenance in order to check their devastation. In other words, to, as they went into this, the Romans, the popular people who were living there, and they were like this, they had to in other words, buy them off, right? To stop, instead of them destroying stuff, we give them sustenance, right? At first, they gave them grain. In other words, okay. On the distribution of grain by Arek, right? First, they gave them grain. Subsequently, they preferred to give them land. So first they gave them grain, then lately they preferred to give them land. The emperors or the Roman magistrates in their name made agreements with them on the division of the country. 12. On the year the Burgundians occupied part of Gaul, they divided the land with the senators of Gaul. This is Marius, Bishop of Antibes, in his chronicle. Right? And is seen in the chronicles and codes of the Visigoths and Burgundians. Okay, this is 13. This is the Lex Rigozovan, the largest Burgundium, and the division continued to exist at the time of Louis the Pious, as appears in his Capitolia of the year 829, which is inserted in the laws Burgundian, right? The Lex Burgundian. Therefore, let us distinguish the procedures of the Burgundians and the Visigoths in Gaul, and the same of the Visigoths in Spain, and the auxiliary soldiers under Romulus Augustus and Ordosa in Italy, from that of the Franks in Gaul and the Vandals in Africa. Again, the Gothic War and Pontus in that sense, right? The first made agreements with the former inhabitants, and consequently division of the lands with them. The second did none of this. So these guys, right? These guys the first made agreements with the former inhabitants and consequently divided the land with them. The Frankins, Gaul, and the Vandals in Africa did none of these. Chapter 8, continue with the same subject. Continue. Again, this is going to be 4 paragraphs. Yeah, 4 paragraphs, correct. Yes, this is 8, 4 paragraphs, and 4 paragraphs. So, what gives the ideas of a great usurpation of Roman land by the barbarian is that one finds in the laws of the Visigoths and the Burgundians that these two people had 2/3 of the land, but the 2/3 were only but the 2/3 were only in certain districts assigned to them. In other words, they had the land, but only certain districts in different places. In the laws of the Burgundians, Ginebad says that his people received 2/3 of the lands at their establishment. And in the second supplement to this law, it is said that no more than 1/2 would be given to those who came later into their country. Right. So therefore, 17. This is at the time it was granted that our people would receive 1/3 of the slaves and 2/3 of the land. In 18 is nothing more may be required of the Burgundians who have come later, other than the present requirements of half the land, right? Therefore, not all lands have been divided in the beginning between the Romans and the Burgundians. So, in other words, not all lands were done. It's only certain parts, right? And then later, even this other, the first part was that 2/3 of the land of their establishment, and then the second. In other words, it wasn't given. In other words, only 2/3 of. But he says 2/3 were only in certain districts assigned to them. Okay, they were given areas. These areas they were given 2/3, and then later they would get less. Right, the later ones would get half. In other words, not all lands were divided at the beginning in this sense. One finds the same expression in the text of these two regulations. Each explains the other, and just as the second cannot be understood to refer to a universal division of lands, one cannot give the meaning to the first. So therefore, this doesn't. Same argument. This is not a universal division of land. Therefore, that is not a universal division of land. The Franks acted with the same moderation as the Burgundians. They did not despoil the Romans throughout the extent of their conquest. And what would they have done with so much land? They took what suited them and left the rest. In other words, the Franks, acted as the same moderation of the Burgundians. They took what they needed. They took what suited them and left the rest. Chapter 9, the just application of the laws of the Burgundians and that of the Visigoths on the division of land. So Burgundians and Visigoths, right, on land. One must consider that these divisions were not made in a tyrannical spirit, but with the idea of providing for the mutual needs of the two people who were to inhabit the same country. In other words, they both had needs. It wasn't that this is going to conquer this people and therefore rule this as that I'm going to destroy you and I'm going to take you and you're going to serve me, right? But rather, no, these people are going to have to live off this, and therefore we're going to have to get our mutual needs in that sense. The Burgundian law wants every Burgundian to be received as a guest in a Roman's home, right? This is in conformity with the mores of the Germans, who, in account of Tacitus, were the people in the world who most liked to practice hospitality. Again, 19. This is Tacitus Germanica, right? This idea of hospitality, right? The laws want the Burgundians to have 2/3 of the land. The law wants the Burgundians to have 2/3 of the land and 1/3 of the serfs. It followed that the genius of the two peoples, and it conformed to the way they granted their sustenance. Right, the Burgundians who grazed their herd needed much lands and few serfs, and the great works of cultivating the land require the Romans who have less land and great number of serfs.
The woods were divided in half because of the needs, because their needs in this regard were the same. So therefore, the woods were divided in half. In other words, the Burgundians needed, because they were, okay, again, remember, the Germanic people were herders, right? They were pastoral, he's saying, remember? So therefore, they needed land so that the animals can move around, right? And they can need the land. They don't necessarily need the labor, the bodies. So therefore, this is why they get 2/3 of the land, but only 1/3 of the serfs. Where the Romans needed what? They were the agrarian. They were the farmers. They were cultivating. They needed labor to cultivate the land. Hence, therefore, they could do so. They can do it effectively on less land. The woods were divided equally because both equally needed them. Right. One sees in the code of the Burgundians that each barbarian was paired with a Roman. Therefore, the division was not general, but the number of Romans who gave a share was equal to the number of Burgundians who received it. The Romans was injured as little as possible. The Burgundians, warrior and hunters and herdsmen, did not disdain taking fallow land. In other words, warriors, hunters, and herdsmen not taking fallow land. The Romans kept the land most appropriate for cultivation. The herders for the herds of the Bulgarian fertilized the Roman field. In other words, the herds of this fertilized the fields of the Roman. So therefore, they would have the land, they would fertilize, but shit and stuff with this, right? Chapter 10 on servitudes. Now, 10 is okay on servitudes, right? It was said. Is said in the laws of the Burgundians that when these people established themselves in Gaul, they received 2/3 of the lands and 1/3 of the serfs. Right, repeat that point. Therefore, servitude to land was established in this part of Gaul before the Burgundians entered into it. So, therefore, there was there was servitude to land. There was slaves. Romans had slaves. Remember, Romans, the large plantations of Gaul under the Romans. I forget the name, Lafunda, right? The Lafundas. I think that's the name of it. These big, giant, huge plantations were worked by slaves. And therefore, this was a Roman leftover in that sense. So therefore, there was this practice of people having slaves to the land in this territory. So therefore, this was there before. It was the servitude to the land was not something created by the Burgundians when they came here, or the Germanics peoples coming here. It was there. It was established in this part of Gaul before the Burgundians entered there. The laws of the Burgundians enacted over the two nations formally distinguish in each of them nobles, freemen, and serfs. Right. And this is where 23. If one knocks out, if someone knocks out the teeth of a Burgundian aristocrat or a Roman noble, and if an ordinary preborn person, either Burgundian or Norman, right, is Roman. In other words, it understands that the status and class and group, right, it's a normal distinguish between each of them nobles of this and freedmen and serfs of the Burgundians and the Germans. Therefore, servitude was not a thing particular to the Romans, or liberty and nobility a thing particular to the barbarians. So therefore, it wasn't, servitude was not a thing just only Romans would serve the serfs, and that Burgundians were liberal, free, and noble. Rather, there was free and noble Romans as well, and and there was probably even Burgundian serfs, not necessarily, but this is the same. This is the same law that if a Burgundian freedman did not give a certain sum to his master, or receive a third's share from a Roman, he was still counted as a member of the master, the family of his master. So if he says that law did not give, in other words, it's the same law says that if a Burgundian freedman did not give a certain sum of his master to his master, or receive a third share from a Roman, he was counted as a member of his family of his master. 24. This is the code of. Therefore, the Roman property owner was free because he was not a member. He was not in the family of another. He was free because his third was a sign of liberty. In other words, his third power, his independence, his paying of the third was a sign of liberty. One had only to open the Salic and Repudian laws to see that the Romans no more lived in servitude among the Franks than among the other conquerors of the Gauls. So therefore, the Salic Repudian laws see that the Romans lived among the Franks, in other words, than other Gauls. The Count of Boulainvillers has fallen short in the chief point of his system. He has not proven that the Franks made a general regulation that put the Romans into a kind of servitude. In other words, this guy makes that, the Franks condemnate, but no. In his work, as his work is written, with no art, and he speaks in it with the simplicity, frankness, and innocence of the old nobility from which he came, everyone is able to judge both the fine things he says and the errors into which he falls. In other words, thus I shall not examine it. So you're not going to examine it in that sense. All right? You're not going to go into offer a detailed examination of this account of Boulainville's history, right? No. I shall say only that he had more spirit than enlightenment. In other words, he had more and more enlightenment than knowledge. But this knowledge was not despicable because he knew well the things about our history and our law. So, in other words, his argument is that, and that's interesting. He's saying, I'm not going to talk about it, but he said he had more spirit than enlightenment. Is that what is it? But in other words, this is interesting. What does he mean by spirit here? More spirit than enlightenment, and more enlightenment than knowledge. Let's see, okay. But this knowledge was not despicable knowledge because he knew well the things of our history and our law. So he knew well the history of France and the law of France in that sense. So he had some knowledge, and it was that he knew well the things of our history and our laws, but it was still limited. And his enlightenment was greater than his knowledge, and his spirit was more than his enlightenment. Right, that's not it. The Count de Boulainvillers and Abbe Dubos have each made a system. The one seeming to be a conspiracy against the third estate, and the other a conspiracy against nobility. So I suspect this is against the third estate conspiracy. By this, there's no nobles against and Noah's third estate, and this is a third estate against a conspiracy against nobility. Right? When the sun gave his chariot to Pharaoh to drive, he said to him, "If you climb too high, you will burn the celestial. You will burn the celestial residence. If you drop too low, you reduce the earth to ashes. Do not go too high. Do not go too high. Sorry. Do not go too far to the right, or you will fall into the constellation of the serpent. Do not go too far to the left, or you will go into that of the altar. Stay between the two." Like this is 25. This is that famous metamorphosis. Do not go too low, do not go too high, either through the ethereal regions. If you rise too much, you will burn the celestial covering. If you fall too much, you will burn the earth. Go the middle way is the safest. neither turn yourself too far to the right towards the coiling serpent, nor guide your wheel to the left to the slide where the altar is. Keep yourself between the two. It is metamorphosis, right? This is a thing from the metamorphosis, and this is his idea. These two guys about this. This is kind of a joke about this. He's making kind of that okay. You go too high, you burn your top, burn the earth, and these two are like these two things here. You go too far this way, you go too far. In other words, there's a conspiracy that the one seems to be a conspiracy against the third estate, and the other is a conspiracy against the nobility. Right? These two of this, and this is what he's saying about that. Chapter 11, continuation of the same subject. 11 is going to be a little long one, 12 paragraphs. So let's see. What has given the idea of a general ruling made at the time of the conquest is that there were a prodigious number of servitudes in France towards the beginning of the reign of the Carpathians, and that as the continuous progress of these servitudes was not noticed, one had imagined in a hazy past a general law that never existed. In other words, when the Carpathian monarchy came up, there was already this servitude, this sense of servitude that was there, and therefore it must have been a general rule, but it wasn't in that sense. In other words, one imagined it in a hazy past, the general law that never existed. At the beginning of the reigns of the Merovingians, there was an infinite number of freedmen, both among the Franks and the Romans. But the number of serfs increased so much that at the beginning of the reign of the Carpathians, all the plowmen and almost all the inhabitants of towns were serfs. And whereas in the towns at the beginning of the Merovingian reigns, there were nearly the same administration as among the Romans, bodies of bourgeoisie, a senate, and the judicial course, one finds near the beginning of the reign of the Carpathians scarcely anything but lords and serfs. In other words, he's saying at the time of the beginning of the Merovingians, there was among the Romans a body of bourgeoisie, senate, and judicial courts. But by the time you get in the Carpathians, everything's either lord or serf. So therefore, there's increasing, there was servitude and bondage than there was earlier, he's saying. When the Franks and Burgundians and Goths invaded, they took all the gold, silver, furniture, clothing, men, women, boys that an army could carry. Everything else was put together and the army divided it. While Gaul was under dominion of the Romans, they formed particular bodies. They were ordinary freedmen of descendants of freedmen, right? 26. Okay, that's the 26. Okay, hold on. 27 is C. Gregory of Tours, and this talks about this in that sense. The entire body of history proves that after the first establishment, that is, after the first ravages, they reached a settlement in which the inhabitants and left them all their political and civil rights. In other words, the Germans came in there, they took what they wanted, but they let them have they made an agreement that they got something, and that they left them with their political and civil rights. This was the right of nations in those times. Everything was taken in war, everything was granted in peace. If it had not been so, how would we find the Salic and Burgundian laws so many provisions in contradiction to the general servitude of men? Right. In other words, why in these Burgundian and Salic laws there's these provisions that in contradiction of all these people are servitude? It was just this conquered, enslaved. No, they left them. So therefore, this is the idea. In other words, they reached their settlements and with them and left them their political and civil rights. And it says this was the right of nations at the time, and everything was taken in war, and everything was granted. Everything was taken in war takes everything you need, and then peace, everything is granted. They're leaving their political and civil rights. But that which contests did not do. Sorry. But that which contests did not do was done by this same right of nations. So, but that which what conquest did not do, was done by this same right of nations. He's saying, okay, what is this? 28. See, Lives of the Saints, right? Which continued to exist after the conquest. So therefore, this right of nations continued to do. So what the conquest did not do, these rights of nations did. Right? Resistance, rebellion, and taking of towns brought with them the servitude of the inhabitants. So therefore, resistance, rebellions, and then the taking of the towns brought servitude of the inhabitants. And as aside from the wars waged between the different conquering nations, among the Franks in particular, the various divisions of the monarchy constantly gave rise to civil wars between brothers or nephews, in which this right of nation was always practiced. Servitude became more general in France than in the other countries, and this is, I believe, one of the causes of the difference between our French laws and those of the Italians and Spain concerning the rights of lords. In other words, he's saying that okay, as the Frankish kings divided up the Frankish kings and elite things divided up their things, the infighting between the brothers and the things who did this led to this conflict of war. In other words, this the right of nations that he's talking to is the right that in everything, as he says, in everything is taken in war and then granted in peace. And while the first conquest but then what happened was the fights and the rebellions, the resistance to a bad ruler. Then what happens is someone conquers them, and then once you conquer them, the town that they all become slaves. So therefore, these Romans who then are on the wrong side of a battle between these two brothers will be fighting, so that when they conquer them, and the people are made servant, taken to them, right? And therefore, everyone becomes a thing. This explains why, in other words, servitude became more general in France, because the fighting in France among the various factions of this, because as the monarchy divided the Carolinian monarchy divided the Frankish monarchy divided various divisions of the monarchy constantly gave rise to civil war between brothers or nephews, right? Conquest was the business of but a moment, and the right of nations that was applied to it produced some servitude. The same right used for several centuries extended a servitude prodigiously. So therefore, in other words, the right of nature was that conquest that you did some is but a conquest is but a single moment, and the right of nation that applied to it brought some servitude. But that same right of nations in its normal situation, the same right used for several centuries, extends servitude prodigiously. Right? Theodoric, believing that the people of Erevin were not faithful to him, said to the Franks of his division, "Follow me. I shall lead you to a country where you will have gold, silver, captives, clothing, and herds in abundance, and you will bring all its men to your country." Right? So Theodoric, while Gaul was under dominion of Romans, they formed particular bodies that were constantly freed men and descendants of freed men. So no, no, 29, right? 29, 29. Sorry, this is Lives of the Saints. Regular tourists. These are the. Sorry, I was reading the wrong thing. Okay, let's go back here. After the peace that was made between the Guntram and Chilfric, Tours again, Gregory Tours, as those who laid siege to Bourges were ordered to return, they took away so much booty they had left almost no men or herds in the country of this place, right? This- When Theodoric, king of Italy, whose spirit and policy was always to distinguish himself from the other barbarian kings, sent his army to Gaul, he wrote to the general. This is classic. This is in the book 3 letter. I want Roman laws to be followed, and you must return fugitive slaves to their masters. Defend liberty. The defenders of liberty should not favor the abandonment of servitude. Let the other kings delight in pillaging and ruining the towns that they have taken. We want to vanquish in such a way that our subjects complain of their having been subjugated so late. In other words, don't make them take their things like this, just subjugate them. It is clear that he wanted to make. It is clear he wanted to make the kings of the make odious. He wanted to make odious the kings of the Franks and the Burgundians, and that he alluded to their rights of nation. In other words, don't follow the Germanic rights of nations of the Germans, their rights of these things of taking by war, and this was going to be bad. They would go by Roman law. In other words, I want Roman law to be followed in that sense. Okay. This right lasted into the reign of the Carolinians. After the army of Pippin had been in Aquitaine, he returned to France laden with infinite numbers of spoils and serfs, according to the Annals of Metz. Yeah. For 32 years, with countless booty and captives, an entire army returned to France wealthy. I would cite innumerable authorities. Um, Again, the Anno French says this is, and the lives of the saints cited in the following note, right? Uh, and and as tender charity, was stirred by these misfortunes, a number of holy bishops, seeing captives shackled two by two, used silver of the churches and even sold the sacred vessels to buy back those whom they could. As holy monks threw themselves into this task, one finds the greatest clarification of the subject in the lives of the saints. Right, 34. This reference in this note to the volumes on the Recruit History de Gauls and in France. Each citation can lead to a complete text in the lives of the saint collected by Bollandus, Morist, and Gregory of Tours. See the lives he says, Saint Evesrus, Saint Epitus, Saint Caesarius, Philodolus, Partisenos, Tervernius, Ulsiclius, Ludginus, and the miracles of Saint Julianus. Right, this is. In other words, he says, what is he saying? That the saints threw themselves at trying to buy they saw them coming there and they took with the wealth they had. Although one can reproach the authors of these lives for having someone been a little too credulous concerning the things God certainly did if they were in the order of design. In other words, one can reproach the authors of these lies for having sometimes been a little too credulous, ridiculous, giving too much credit concerning the things God did, certainly did, that God certainly did if they were in order of his design. One cannot fail to see considerable enlightenment in these lives about the mores and usages of those times. So therefore, even if he's attributing too much to God, he still you see a lot of this in terms of the mores and usages of this time. When one examines the records of our history and our laws, it seems that everything ends in a C, and that the sea lacks even when one examines history records of our history and our lands, it seems that everything is a sea, and that sea lacks even a shore. The metaphor, right? From this is the shores were lacking up to the sea, right? This is Metamorphosis, book one, right? Again, this is all these cold, dry, insipid, and harsh writings must be read, must be devoured, as the fable tells us, and as the fable tells us, satin devoured stones, right? We have to read these lores and this stuff to see that okay, everything is sea, and the sea lacks the shore, and these cold, dry stories must be read and devoured as as satin devour the stones, right? In an infinity of land that freedmen made productive became subject to moratorium. Moratorium, 36. Even the colonists were not. Even the colonists were not all serfs. See law 18. See laws 18 and 23 of the code, right? Um, and laws 20 of the same title, right? This is you know status of lands or testaments, right? Incapable of, inalienated by an ecclesiastic or other corporation. So therefore, there was, in other words, it became that freemen made productive became this subject to this unable to be changed law, to taken over into the. When a country lost the freedmen who had lived there, those who had many serfs, those who had many serfs took or had ceded to themselves great territories and built villages on them, as is seen in the various charters. In other words, that they had this. In other words, that these lands they were more subject to dissolving. When the country lost its freedmen who lived there, those who had many serfs took or had ceded to themselves great territories. Right, they built villages there of serfs in a sense. As in other words, and on the other hand, the freedmen who had cultivated the arts became serfs. Became serfs who had to exercise them. The freedmen who had cultivated the arts became to uh, uh, serfs who had to exercise them. Servitude gave back to the arts and to tilling what had been taken from them. So servitude is given to both the arts and to tilling what had been taken from what them is the tilling in the arts, or yeah, tilling in the arts. So on the other hand, freemen who had cultivated the arts became serfs, who had to exercise them. In other words, servitude gave back to the arts and to tilling what had been taken from them. It is usual to give these lands to the churches, to be held for the census, to be held for the owners of land believed that by their servitude they pacified in the saintliness of the church. In other words, they would give they would give this property, they give these things to the church, thinking that this would, make them holy, make them proper. So they earned their keep in that sense. Chapter 12. On the lands divided by the barbarians, on the lands divided by barbarians, did not pay tax. So therefore, the lands that divided by the barbarians did not pay tax. Those simple, simple, poor, free, warlike, and pastoral people who were without industry and who attached to their lands only by their reed huts. Right. Um, uh, this is good tours. They were reed huts. Followed their leaders in order to get booty, and not in order to pay, or to levy taxes. They got their booty. They didn't get in order to pay or to levy taxes. Right. The art of abusive taxation is always invented afterwards, when men began to enjoy the felicity of the arts. Right. This is again deed malrate. The art of this mallet, abuse of taxation, is always invented afterwards. In other words, they didn't do this; they got booty not to pay, not in order to pay or to levy taxes. They didn't decide to. We're going to get revenue from this. Oh, they get the goodies, the good booty. They wanted booty. They wanted goods and things. And what happened was that came afterwards. Booty, levying taxes was an afterthought in that sense. He's saying. The transitory tax, of a jug of wine for each aspirant of land. Again, regulators, right? Aspirant of land. One of the harassments inspired by Chilfrich and Fredegund, Friedegund, concerning only the Romans. In other words, this jug of wine for each land. Got to give a thing of wine for this was only applied to the Romans. Indeed, the Franks, not the ecclesiastics who. Indeed, the Franks, not the ecclesiastics who in these times were all Roman, tore up the rolls of these assessments. It was the words. Indeed, the Franks, not the ecclesiastics, who tore up the rolls. This distressing tax principally affected the inhabitants of the towns. Now, almost all towns were inhabited by the Romans. The tribute, in other words, the tribute was introduced throughout all the cities of Gaul. Right, this idea. Regulator says that after the death of Chilfrich, a certain judge was obliged to take refuge in a church for having, in the reign of that prince, subjected to taxation Franks who were in Childebrand's time freeborn. Multus de Francus qui qualtus Childebrand regi ingente figurate publico triblo subjecte. Okay, this is. Okay. Who in the time of Chamberlain executed public taxes from many Franks who were freeborn. Montesquieu here gives the Latin he translated for the previous clause. Therefore, he said it here and then gives the Latin of it, right? Therefore, the Franks who were not serfs did not pay taxes. The Franks who were not serfs did not pay taxes. Any grammarian would pale at seeing how this passage was interpreted by Abbé de Blois, 42, in his establishment of monarchy in France. Right? It would grammarian look at, oh my God. He remarks that in those times freedmen were also called freeborn. Therefore, he translates the Latin word ingenita by the words Frances de tribute. Free from the tribute, right? Therefore, sorry, I'll get this right. Frankly, right? The word frank, ingenuity, is free from the tribute, freed from those from taxes. The expression which can be used in French as one says, affranchis de sons, therefore free from cares, and affranchis de depends, those free from penalties. But in Latin, in grenti, in tribute, freed from taxes, the member of a class of freedmen from taxes, the liberty attribute, a member of the class of free, member of a class of freemen from taxes, and missini tributori, and emancipated men from taxes would be monstrous expressions. Monstrous expression would be monstrous. So therefore, he said that it said this is this and freed from this, freed from that, but this is not. This is he's specifically libertina in Goethe, that is a member of a class of freedmen from taxes. This is libertine and freedmen from taxes. There's a different structure of this. Parthenius, says Gregory Tours, feared that he would be put to death by the Franks for having imposed taxes on them. And Abbe Dusseur, pressed by this passage, coolly assumes that in this that which is in question, that he says an additional burden. 24. History of Establishment of Monarchy, right? Du Bois. One sees in the laws of the Visigoths that when a barbarian occupied the land of a Roman, the judge obliged him to sell it in order for this land to continue to be tributary, the tributes, right? Therefore, the Romans paid no taxes on the barbarians paid no taxes on the land. The judge, and again, this is that line of 25 that the judges and the subordinate of the court of a count should take away Roman lands from those who hold them in usurpation. They should restore these extractions due to the Romans from the Romans without delay, so that the treasury may be no way harmed. Right, and the vassal paid none. The Vandals paid none in Africa. In that sense, right? History of Rome. That note that these note that those who conjured Africa was a combination of conquered. Sorry, that's conquered. Conquered Africa was a combination of Vandals and Franks, right? And no taxes, okay? In other words, the Abbe de Bois, who needed the Visigoths to pay taxes, departed from the literal and spiritual meaning and images solely because he imagines that there had been an establishment of they had been the establishment of the Goths, and this law had an increase of taxes which concerned only the Romans. But it is permitted, only to Father Hadrian, thus to exercise an arbitrary power over the facts. In other words, he doesn't. Dubois, in other words, the Abbé de Bois and says but it's permitted only to Father Herman to thus exercise an arbitrary power over fact, change the facts. In other words, the Abbé de Bois seeks laws in the Justinian Code to prove that the military benefices among the Romans were subject to taxation, from which he concludes that it was the same for the fiefs or benefices among the Franks. But the opinion that our fiefs originated in the establishment of the Romans is condemned today. It was accredited only at the time when Roman history was known, and our own, very little known. And when our old records were buried in dust. In other words, once they, us Enlightenment, in other words, once they, in other words, that this idea that the Roman law was meant by the Franks, no,
Once you've got actually, that's because Roman law was known. The history of the Franks and Burgundians were not. They were not known, and they were lost. They were dust. They were just. They weren't really looked out there. The Abbé Dubois is wrong to cite Cassiodorus and to use what happened in Italy and in the part of Gaul subject to Theodoric to inform us of the usage among the Franks. These are things that must not be confused. I shall some day show that in a separate work that the plan of the monarchy of the Ostrogoths was entirely different from the plan of the ones. In other words, someday show in a separate work, the plan of the monarchy of the Ostrogoths was entirely different from the plan of the ones plans of the ones founded in those times by the other barbaric peoples, and that far from being able to say something was a usage among the Franks because it was among the Ostrogoths. One is, on the contrary, quite correct in thinking that the thing practiced among the Ostrogoths would not be practiced among the Franks. In other words, he's saying, in other words, okay, so I show that the Ostrogoths had completely different understanding of monarchy of this stuff. It was a different plan of how they founded on times of the barbarian peoples, right? And it's therefore that to say just because something was done among by the Ostrogoths does not mean they'll be done by the Franks. What is done most reluctantly by those whose spirit floats with the vast erudition is to seek their proofs in the places that are not foreign to the subjects, and to find, as astronomers say, the sun's position. In other words, this is the problem. This is they look for the sun's position. They find the sun's position. They look for this. In other words, what is done most reluctantly by those whose spirit floats with vast talking is to seek their proofs in the places that are not foreign to their subjects. They know that they go to the things they know and they think, right? They're not, and to find the sun's. Oh yeah, I got to say I see a sun. There it is. I know that. I see that. Okay, but the other stars. Okay, the Abbé Dubois abuses. The Abbé Dubois abuses capitaries as he does history and the laws of the barbarian people and the laws. So he abuses not only the history and the laws of barbarian people, he does it the capitary. He wants the Franks to have paid taxes. He applies to freedmen what can be understood only of serfs. Again, this is the notes to what he did, right? And he wants to speak of their soldiery. He applies to, in other words, he applies to freedmen can be only applied to serf when he wants to speak of their soldiery. He applies to serfs what could concern only freedmen. Right. This again, the bit. In other words, he applies the serf with only. Talking about the soldiery. Freedmen are the soldiers, not the serfs in that sense. So, okay, therefore he's applying to this the serfs. Chapter 13. What burdens were borne by the Romans and the Gauls and the monarchy of the Franks, right? I could examine whether the Romans and the defeated Gauls continued to pay burdens, servitudes, servitudes of land, right? Burdens to which they had been subject under the emperors. In other words, did they have to pay these things as they would have been subject to the Gauls in this sense, or tributes in that sense, right? But in order to move more rapidly, I shall content myself with saying that if they paid them at first, they were soon exempted from them, and that these taxes were changed into military service. So therefore, maybe they were taxed, they were exempted from them, and then later they were required to do
and then these then and that these taxes were changed into military service. And I admit that I can scarcely conceive how the Franks could at first have been so fond of abusive taxation, and could suddenly have appeared so and could suddenly have appeared so far from it. In other words, they flee it, they give it up. In other words, they do it. In other words, they're fond of the taxation, but then all of a sudden appear so far from it. How can I explain that? In other words, I can't conceive that. Right? The Capitularies of Louis the Pious explains very well to us the state of the freemen of the Frankish monarchy. In the year 1580, chapter 1, it is in conformity with the Capitulary of Charles the Bald of that same year, of the year 844. Some bands of Goths or Iberians fleeing the oppression of the Moors were received in the lands of Louis. Right, this is 54. On behalf of those staying in Spain on part of Equita, Sempere, and Provence. The agreement made with them indicates that, like other freemen, they would go to the army with their count, that in the outpost they will stand guard and go on patrol on the orders of the same count. Keep watch scouting, which is called watcha, right? Watch, right? Um, and that they would give horses and chariots for vehicles to the deputies of the king and to the ambassadors who came from his court or went to him. 56. They were not obliged to give any to the count in that sense, right? Only to that. And besides, they would not be constrained to pay any other census, and that they would be treated like other freedmen. So he says, look at this. This is Louis the Pious talking about this, about those people coming there. No, they're treated as same any other freedmen. They were exempted from something. They would do service. One cannot say that these were new usages introduced at the beginning of the reign of the Carolinians. They must have belonged at least to the middle or the end of end of that of the Merovingians. The Capitularies of 864 says explicitly that it was an old custom for freedmen to provide military service and to provide pay for the horses and vehicles for which we have spoken. 57. The Franks of Agapus, who had that the Franks of Agapus, who have a horse to go with their own count among the hosts, right? It is forbidden to the count to take away their horses, for they would not be able to join the host or provide the post horse requisition in accordance with the ancient custom, right? This is that. So therefore, again, he's saying that in other words, it's okay. It's old custom that the freemen have provided certain horses, burdens that were particular to them, and from which those who possessed fiefs were exempt, as I shall later prove. If you possess fiefs, if you were a possession of a fief, you didn't have to do those things. Freemen didn't. A fief didn't have to. Were exempted from those requirements in that sense. It is. This is not all. It was a regulation that scarcely permitted subjecting those. It was scarcely a regulation that scarcely permitted subject. Sorry. There was a regulation that scarcely permitted subjecting those freedmen to taxes. 58. The Capitulary Charlemagne. He who had four manors was always obliged to go to war. He who had only three was paired with a freedman who had only one. The latter defrayed the expense by a quarter and stayed home. Similarly, two freedmen who each had two manors were paired. Half of the expense of the man who went was defrayed by the one who remained. So 59, the quattromesso. It seems to me what is called manus was a certain proportion of land attached to his manus where there were slaves. Witness the Capitol of the year 853 Acudus Civilis against those who drove slaves off the manus, of the manors, right? So therefore, there was like this. That there was the whole argument of those who had four was always obliged to go to war. Those who had three was paid to a freedman, and the latter defrayed the expense by a quarter and stayed home. In other words, the freedmen stayed home, and necessarily the two freedmen who each had two manors were paired. Half the expense of the man who went was defrayed by the one who remained. So, in this case, he went there. He was paid by this guy. There is more. We have an infinity of charters in which the privilege of fief are given to lands or districts possessed by freedmen, of which I shall later speak of length in what follows. Right, in other words, 60. See chapter 20 below. Okay. Right. These lands were exempted from all burdens required by them, and required of them by the counts and the other officers of the king. And these burdens are enumerated in detail, in that there is no question of taxes in them. It is obvious that they were not levied. So there's no taxes. There's all these things, the burdens and things are spelled out in these laws and and that therefore there was no question of taxes. They're not burdened. It was easy for the abuse of taxations of the Romans to fall of itself in the Frankish monarchy. In other words, it was easy for this abuse of taxation of the Romans to fall of itself in this manner. It was a very complicated art which entered into neither the idea nor the plan of these simple people. If the Tartars overran Europe today, they would have to have such experience in public business before they understood what a tax farmer is. The word here is financier, one who manages the finance of the king. It's a tax farmer. If you financier, understand what a financier, tax farmer, is. Financial farmer. The unknown author of the life of The unknown author of the life of Louis the Pious said of the counts and the other officers of the nation of Franks established by Charlemagne and Aquitaine that he gave them the defense of the frontiers, the military power, the management of the domains belonging to their crown. This shows, in other words, yeah. This shows the state of the revenues of Charlemagne's princes. The prince had kept domains. The prince had kept domains and made them productive with his slaves. But the indictions, the capulations, and other imposts levied in the time of the emperors on the person or goods of freedmen had been changed into obligations to defend the frontiers or go to war. Ah. One can see this in the same. One can see this in the same history that when Louis the Pious went to meet his father in Germany, this prince asked him how could he be so poor, for he was king. That Louis replied he was a king in name only, and that the lords held most of his domains. That Charlemagne, fearing this young prince might lose their affection if he himself took back what he had thoughtlessly given away, sent commissioners to reestablish these things, right? Again, this is the edition saying this idea of, again, this history. In other words, he wanted to see his father, Charlemagne, feeling that the same person would lose the affection if he himself took back this thing. So he went there and took things back. The bishops writing to Louis, brother of Charles the Bald, brother of Charles the Bald, brother of Charles the Bald, said to him, "Take care of your lands, so that you will not be obliged to travel constantly and stay in the households of ecclesiastics, and and tire their serfs with your vehicles." Right? See the this idea is this. Don't bishops writing to Louis of this. Take care of your lands. Don't be obliged to travel constantly and stay in house ecclesiasticals and tire their. They further said, "See to it that you have enough to live on and receive embassies." It is obvious that the king's revenues at that time lay in his domains. Right? This is this idea. This is the J of this. Royal domains are called fisci in that sense, right? Domains. Number 14. What was called the census? When barbarians left the country, they wanted to put their usages into writing. But when they found it difficult to write German words with Roman letters, these laws were written in Latin. Okay, so therefore, this is that they didn't use German laws; they with Latin Roman letters. These laws were written in Latin. So therefore, um, um, in the confusion of the conquest and the progression, most things change their nature. So therefore, the confusion of the conquest and progression, most things change their nature. In order to express them, one has to use old Latin words that were the most closely related to new usages. So therefore, you use, in other words, they would use new Latin words that were close to what these things were. Okay, they would use old Latin words that was close to these. Thus, what they could elicit, the idea of the old census of the Romans, was named census tributum. Okay, census indicated, according to Montesquieu's use of the Latin word census. A census translated in French was cens, tributes, italicized, indicating the Latin word tributum, tax, applied the French word tribute, right? So the Roman name census tributatum, and when things had no relation whatever to them, the one expressed as one could German words with Roman letters. Thus was the word freedom, of which I shall speak at length in other chapters. Freedom. In other words, freedom. That's what the old Latin words we use in this idea of tribute, right? Tribute, tax, of this. But freedom, right? As the words census and tributus were thus used as in an arbitrary way, this had cast some obscurity into the meaning that they had under the Merovingians and Carolinians. And then modern authors, 66, he says, the census was a generic word, that it was referred to the tolls of rivers. It was a generic word, and that if it was used to refer to the tolls of rivers, when there was a bridge or a ferry. See this comparative. It says, um, um, Also called by this name were the vehicles furnished by a freedman to the king or his envoys, as appears in the Capitary of Charles the Bald in the year 865. Okay, that's the earlier census and that type of. But here, 66 is Abbe de Boers, and those who followed him are these. Who are these many authors, right? If you look at this, and I see obscurity of the meaning of this, and when many authors with particular systems have found these words in the writings of that time, they have what they were called, judged what was called the census was precisely the Roman census, and they have drawn the consequence from it. And the kings of the Merovingians and Carolingians' reigns took the place of the Roman emperors and changed nothing in their administration. Word 67. See the weakness of reasons of Abbe du Bois, especially his introduction he makes from the passage of Gregory Tours concerning the connection between Gregory's church and King Charabet, right? And as certain rights levied under the Carolingians were by chance and certain modifications converted into other rights um, by emancipations, for example, right? uh, converted into other rights. Modern authors have concluded that these rights were the Roman census. And as they had seen with the modern regulations, the domains of the crown became absolutely inalienable. They have said that those rights which present the Roman census and which do not form part of the domain were pure usurpations. I shall say nothing of the other consequences. In other words, he's just right here in this paragraph, he's just basically showing how these Abbe and the modern people misunderstood what was going on in the Latin as the Franks were using Latin at this time. Um, to carry back to distant centuries the idea of this ideas of the century in which one lives is of all sources of error the most fertile. In other words, we we bring to distant century the ideas of the century we live. This is also the most fertile common error. To these people, no, to those people who want to render all the earlier centuries modern, I shall say what the priest of Egypt said to Solon: "You Athenians, you are nothing but children." Okay. In other words, those who want to make everyone modern, no, you are just nothing but children. Right? It's not they're not modern in that sense. Chapter 15. What was called the census was not only levied on serfs, was levied only on serfs and not on freedmen. So therefore, the census, what was the census, was on serfs and not freedmen. The king, the ecclesiastics, and the lords each levied regular taxes on the serfs of their domain. I prove it was in regard to the king by the Capitulary de Villis, in regards to ecclesiastics, by the code of laws, by the code of laws of the barbarians, in regard to the lords, by the regulations that Charlemagne made for them. Book 5 of the Capillaries, right? In other words, so therefore, the king, the ecclesiastical lords, they levied taxes. The kings were done by the Capita Vigilis in regards to the allegories by the codes of the barbarians, and then in regards to the lords by the regulations Charlemagne. These taxes were called census. They were economic and not fiscal rights. In other words, they were economic and not fiscal rights. They were exclusively private ground rents, not public burdens. Di reveni ulan province et non pas charges. In other words, they weren't public charges in that sense. They were not burdens of this right. These were census were therefore their economic policy and not a fiscal right. They were extensively private ground rents. That was like that. The economic, this was not really understood as a fiscal right in that sense. I say that what was called the census was a levied tax on the serfs. I prove it by a formula from Markov, which is a permission from the king to one from the king for one to become a cleric, provided that he was a freeborn and was not enrolled in the register of the census. Right, if he was not in the census. Permission of the king, which is permission from the king for one to become a cleric, provided he was freeborn and not this. I prove it also by the commission that Charlemagne gave to a count he sent into the region of Saxony. It contained the freeing of Saxons. It contained the freeing of Saxons because they had embraced Christianity. This this is, properly speaking, a charter establishing them as freeborn. If a man is really freeborn and is not registered in public census, the Markov formula, and this is sworn and attested document establishes his personal status as a freeman, right? So therefore, he sent them into Saxony because they have embraced Christianity. And this is speaking a charter established them as freeborn. This prince reestablishes their first civil liberty and exempts them from paying the census, giving them all their former liberties and are freed from the census. In that sense, this is from. Therefore, these things were the same: to be a serf and to pay the census, to be free and not pay it. So that's clear. By a kind of letter patent from the same prince on behalf of the Spaniard who had been received into the monarchy. This is 75, right? This is this letter patent from a Spaniard who had been received in the monarchy. Counts were prohibited from requiring any census from them and from taking their lands away. It was known that foreigners arriving in France were treated like serfs, and Charlemagne wanted them to be regarded as freedmen because he wanted them to own their land. He prohibited requiring census of them. So therefore, if, foreigners who came into France, the problem is they were going to be treated like serfs. They wouldn't be able to own land. They would not do this. Charlemagne wanted them to be freedmen because he wanted to own their land. A capitulatory of Charles the Bald, given in favor of those same Spaniards, wanted them to be treated as were the other Franks and prohibited enacting a census from them. Therefore, freedmen did not pay it. Article 30 of the Edicts of Pistis. These laws are of the capacity of Franklin, right? Of Pistis. The Article 30 of this Edict of Pistis reforms the abuse by which many colonists belonging to the king or to the church sold the dependents' lands of their manors to ecclesiastics or to people of their condition and kept for themselves only a small dwelling, with the result that they could no longer be asked to pay the census. It was ordered that the first state of things be reestablished. Therefore, the census was a tax taken from slaves. Right? So therefore, this is indicating that this was abuse of this, and therefore they're giving it back to them. A further result is that there was no general census in the monarchy, and this was clear from a great number of texts. For what for what would the cap okay for what would the capillary we want the royal census required in all places where formerly it was required legitimately mean, right? So this is the from whatever place it was to be exactly legitimately, right? This is would mean would re, in other words require legitimately the places where it formerly was required legitimately mean. When was this? What is this? This we want the royal census required in all places where it was formerly required legitimately mean. That's what he's saying. Now, what would the meaning? What would be the meaning of the one in which Charlemagne orders his deputies in the province to make an exact study of every census which had formerly belonged to the king's domain, and the one in which he disposes of the census paid by those whom it was required? Again, this is what is the meaning is to be what meaning is to be given to this one, which reads, if someone had acquired tributary land on which we were accustomed to levy the census, or finally to this other one, in which Charles the Bald speaks of the land of the census, whose census belongs to the king from the most remote times. Right? This is again from the census enacted for the king's portion from old. Right? Notice that there are some texts in which at first seem contrary to what I have said and which nevertheless confirm it. It has been seen from it has been seen above that freedmen in the monarchy were obliged only to provide certain vehicles. The capitory that I have just cited calls this census and opposes it to the census paid by serfs. So even though he uses the term to talk about this as census, it is then contrasted to the census paid by serfs. So it's not the same. In addition, the Edicts of Peter speaks of those freedmen, freedmen, uh, 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 all Miss Frank's, speaks of those freedmen who had to pay the royal census by head and for their cottages, and who had sold themselves during the famine, right? They've sold themselves. There's freedmen who had to pay the census because they sold themselves in the famine. The king wants to buy the king wants to buy them back. This is because those who were freed by letters of the king did not ordinarily require a full and entire liberty, but paid the census in cap. And these were people who that were, and these are the people who referred to here, right? One must rid oneself of the idea of a general universal census derived from the police of the Romans, and that which is assumed that the rights of the lords were similarly derived from usurpations. What was called census in the French monarchy, independent of the abuse of the word has seen, was a particular right levied on serfs by masters. So therefore, this was a particular right, a P, which is again this droit right, uh, 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 law. This particular law, or particular right, droit, was levied on serf by their master. So it wasn't a right of the state to collect money; it was rather a master to collect money from that. Right? I beg the reader's pardon for the deadly boredom that so many citations must give. I would be briefer if I did not still find in front of me the book The Establishments of the French Monarchy and World by Abbe de Bois. Nothing pushes back the progress of knowledge like a bad work by a famous author because before instructing, one must begin by correcting the mistakes. So again, this is a great answer. A very important person gives a very important book. Everyone reads it, but it's wrong. So he has to go, undo the error, right? Chapter 16 is on ludus or vassals. I have spoken of those volunteers among the Germans who would follow the princes in their enterprises. The same usage remained after the conquest. Tacitus designates them by the name companions, right? 92. Comitus, comitus, right? The Salic law by that of the men who give fealty to the king, right? Yeah, those who are armed retainers, tristi of the king, right? The formula of Markov by that of en- entrustation, entrustation, a trustration of the king, 95, from the word truvel, which means faithful among the Germans and among the English true, right? Means true, it means faithful in German, and English means true, right? From true, very weird thing. Um, from the entrustations of the king. Our first historians, by that of the Luders, the faithful, that of the Luders, the faithful, and by later historians, that of vassal and lord, right? So let's, 96, this is Luda Fideles, Vassili Signores, um, and Q, these quotation marks are not in the text. So the quotation marks on these words the editors. One finds in the Salic and Riparian laws an infinite number of provisions for the Franks and only a few for the Antitrustans. Right? So therefore, in these laws, there's lots of provisions for the Franks, but very few. Provisions concerning the Antitrustans and trustians are different from those made for the other Franks. Everywhere the goods of the Franks are regulated, and nothing is said of those of the Etruscans. So therefore, the Etruscans. This is a result of the goods of the latter being regulated by political law rather than civil law, and being a share that fell to an army and not the patrimony of a family. So therefore, Etruscans were like something from war, civil. They were political law rather than civil law. They were not tied to the family. They were not a patrimony of a family in that sense. Various writers at various periods have called these goods reserved for the luders the goods of the fisc, benefices, honors, fiefs, right? Here, as now elsewhere, we have used the original Latin words rather than translating the Gallicisms into English. Um, is that L? No, it's not L. It is T. No, it's R. Sorry, I'm sorry. I lost my. It's R. Here we have, in other words, here is something of a definition of the scope of the connection between beings for the Lords, and quotation marks again not intact. So therefore, this is why it's the words the various rates are called the goods reserved for the Lords, goods of fiscs, beneficence, and honors. Right? Fiscala. It was said in the life of Saint Mary, he gave fiscs. He gave a retinue and many fiscs. Goods intended for the maintenance of the royal family were called regalia. So regalia and fiscs, so therefore must be tied to that. It cannot be doubted that fiefs were at first revocable. So therefore, is heated defaultness, right? Cassius in his book and commentary. At first, the fiefs were revocable. One can see in Gregory of Tours that everything that Sungisil and Gallimimus had from the fisc was taken away from them, and that they were left with only what they held as property. In property, right? The rights of this, that the feast, that they were, the so-called what they had in fiscs was taken away from them, but their property was kept. When Gundan put his nephew Shilibit on the throne, he met secretly with him and indicated to him those to whom should give fiefs, he should give fiefs, and those from whom he should take them away, right? This is idea. This is 101. Those who should give honors with gifts, and those who should be banished from office or honors. Um, uh, uh, um, the formula of Markov gave the king gave not only benefices that his fiscs held, but also those that another had held, right? Others had held, one or two. That such and such person be recognized to hold the position as part of the benefices of another or part of our fisc. Hmm, long video, I'm sorry. Um, the laws of the Lombard contrast benefits with property. So Lombards contrast benefits with property in that sense. So therefore, the Franks didn't contrast these benefits with property. The Lombards did, right? The historians and formulas and the codes of different barbarian peoples, all the remaining records are unanimous. Finally, those who wrote the book on fiefs, we learn that at first the lords could take fiefs away at will, that later they secured them for a year and then afterwards gave them for life. So therefore, at first they could give and take at will, then they were given like a period, like 1 year, and then afterwards they could be given for life. Once they were always there. Chapter 17 on the military service of a freedman. Two kinds of men were held to military service: the vassalios, or under vassals, who were obliged to do it as a consequence of their fief, and freedmen who were Franks, Romans, and Gauls, who served under the count and were led by him and his officers. So therefore, the freedmen, the two types: the under vassals, under ludas or under vassals, who were obliged of this under their agreement under fief, and then the freemen who were Franks, Romans, and Gauls, right? And they were under the count and were led by him and his officers. The men who, on the one hand, had neither beneficiaries nor fiefs, and who, on the other, were not subject to serfdom, were called freedmen. The lands they possessed were called the Eloyo lands. So this is Eloyo lands, right? This is what is the lands that the freedmen had as the loyal land. The counts gathered the freedmen together and led them to war. Right. See the picture of this. The counts would lead the freedmen to war. They had officers under them, which they called uh, 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 vicaria, right? Yeah, vicars, right? Vicars, and each had count had a vicaria and censura with him, right? This is the idea of vicaria. So all the offices under them were called vicare, and all the freemen were divided into centuri, which were formed what was called a borough, and counts had also under them officers who were called centauri, who led the freemen of a borough, or was a centaur, or their centaur to war. So this is T. Here in our sons we have used the original Latin words rather than transliterate the Gallicism into English. So therefore they just changing things. So therefore this is the problem. You had the Centauri, which formed the borough, right? The counts of them, the counties, right? Uh, 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 um, the, under the officers called Centauri, who led freemen of the borough, right? Uh, uh, or uh, uh, or their centre. That's under. The freedmen were divided into centre, from which formed what was called a borough, and the counts is also under officers of the centuri. Okay, centuri, larger thing, who led the freedmen of the borough. What is 408? How does this work? These were called compagnies. Okay, this is very confusing in that sense. The division by centuri is later than the establishment of the Franks in Gaul. It was made by Clotaire and Childebert with a view to obtaining each district to be responsible for the robberies it might have. This is seen in the decrees of the princes. A similar police is still observed today in England. The militia, right? This is the militia. This is that the establishment of these local militias, the police to enforce the law, the robbery, maintain this robbery on the highway, the militia, right? This is that same thing. As the count led, as the counts led the freedmen to war, the lud also led the vassals under vassals, and the bishops or abbots, and the bishops, abbots, or their protectors, led theirs. The advocati, right, or the caprices of this. The bishops were quite confused. They were not in agreement about what they were to do. Right, this is that famous line. So number 12. And see the Capaccia of the year 1803 at Worms. That's it. What do we have to do? What do we have to do? Don't know. They asked Charlemagne not to oblige them to go to war any longer, and when they had ordained this, they complained that they had been made to lose. When they ordained this, they complained been that they had been made to lose public regard, and this prince was obliged to justify his intention in this respect. Be that as it may, when the time came that they no longer went to war, I do not see that their vassals were led to war by counts. On the contrary, one sees that the kings or bishop chose the king. The kings or bishop chose one of the faithful to lead them. The faithful. So is the U. See note T above. Here's that. to lead them. 13. This is the ballistic capitary. Sorry, I'm going back and forth. Annoying. And from the capitory, I mean, decree of Louis V, or Pius, right? The king distinguishes three sorts of vassals: those of the king, those of the bishop, and those of the count. So these different vassals. Vassals of a lord or lord were led to war by the counts only when some employment in the household of the king kept these lords from leading themselves. Right. In other words, 15. Concerning those vassals who serve the lord's household and who are recognized to have certain benefices, it is decreed that those who remain in imperial household do not retain them with them their vessels. These instead are permitted to go to war with the count of their country. So those people who had done this, either done to the emperor, right, or um, this is why the Kippites are opposed. In other words, okay. Led by law, counts were only when they employment the household of the king kept these things from leading them themselves. Therefore, the count would then lead those people in there, right? But who led the leudes to war, right? There is no doubt it was the king, who was always at the head of this faithful. So the king and these leudes, or the companions, was faithful. This was why this is why one always sees in the capitularies an opposition between the vassal of the king and those of the bishops, right? As to our men and those of the bishop and abbots, who have either benefices or estates of their own, right? This is why there has to be a distinction between them, right? Um, our courageous Our courageous, proud, and magnificent kings surely did not enter the army to put themselves at the head of the ecclesiastical soldiery. They surely did not choose these people to vanquish or die with. These people are not going to be vanquished or die with them. He's not going to head those people. But these likewise led their vassals and under vassals, and this is shown very well in the capitory in which Charlemagne orders each freeman who had four manors, whether as his own property or someone's benefits, to go against the enemy or his fellow, or to follow the Lord. Um, and that any freeman who has four manors of his own or has benefits from another, he should prepare to defend himself and go to the host, either with his lord or with his count. Right, this is right from the source in that sense. It is evident that Charlemagne meant that one who had only one plot of his own entered the soldiery of his count, and that one who held a benefice from a lord went with him, the lord that was in question. However, the Abbe Dubois claims that when the capitory mentions men who were dependent on a particular lord, only serfs are in question, right? This is what he says. And this claim is founded on the law of the Visigoths and the practice of the people. It would be better founded on the capitories themselves. In other words, don't look at this is how this. Look at the actual capitories of the Franks. Don't go look at the Visigoths in this side. See, Du Bois goes to the Visigoths and say, well, they did that, and the practice of the people, the people, the Visigoths, right? And they say, oh, they did that, therefore the Franks did this. This is what this means. No. The one I have just cited expressly contradicts this. The treaty between Charles the Bald and his brothers speaks likewise of freedmen who can make their choices between a lord and a king, and this provision is in conformity with many others. Therefore, one can say that there were three kinds of soldiery: that of the lords or the faithful to the king, one, who themselves had others of the faithful dependent upon them, right? That of the bishops and other ecclesiastics. So therefore, the lord of that, who had the favor of the king, who themselves had people faithful to them, right? That of the bishops and other ecclesiastics or their vessels, the bishops and that of the bishops, those and their vassals, and finally that of the count who would lead the freedmen. I do not say that the vassals could not be subject to the count, for those who have a particular command are dependent on those who have a more general one, right? So a particular command has more are dependent upon those who have a more general one. So a vassal has a particular command, but that could be just a general one is up there, right? One can see that the count and the deputies of the king could even make them pay the ban, that is, a fine, if they had not fulfilled the engagement of their fight. In other words, if they didn't do what they're supposed to do of this, they could be paid a fine for this, right? Likewise, if the vassal of the king pillaged, they were subject. In other words, the vassals of the king, they were subject to correction by the count, unless they preferred to submit to that of the king. So therefore, the vassal could, in other words, if they were pillaging, they were subject to the count, punished correction by the count, unless they preferred being punished by the king. Chapter 18, on double service. It was a fundamental principle of monarchy that those who were under someone's military power were also under civil jurisdiction. This was the capitory of Louis the Pious in 815, made the count's military power and his civil jurisdiction over freedmen go together. Thus, the platissa of the count, who led the freedmen to war, were called the platissa of freedmen. Okay, the platissa is like the okay, this unit of the count, which led to the called the platissa of freedmen. Ooh, okay, this okay. From which doubtless resulted from the maxim that it was only in the count's platea and not in those of his officers that one could judge questions of liberty. So therefore, the count became not only in terms of regarding military actions, he also became of what do you call what he just said, civil jurisdiction, right? The questions of trial and the punishment and the crimes in that sense. So could not only, in other words, not only those of his officers that one could judge the questions of liberty, right? Thus, the count did not lead the vassals of the bishop or the abbots to war. 23, right? This is again, they did not do this. They were because they were not under his civil jurisdiction. Thus, he did not lead the under vassals of the Lord. Thus, the glossary in the English laws 224, that is, which found under the of this word, a Greek word, epigenia, civ. In other words, this is which is again basically saying he misread Uru and just described copy. It was a textual correction, right? In other words, thus the glossary of the English laws tell us that those whom the Saxon called copies were styled by the Norman Comte and companions because they divided the fiscal fines with the king. Judicial, because they divided the fiscal fines with the king. Thus, we see in all times the obligation of each vassal to his lord was to bear arms and to judge his peers in the lord's court. So, therefore, a vassal of his lord was to bear arms and to judge his peers, civil aspects. So, therefore, this was seen. In other words, we have to understand this through the Normans. The Normans followed the Saxon copied by those whom the Saxon called copies were styled after this thing. So therefore, this is by the English laws, right? One of the reasons that attached the rights of justice to the rights of leading war was that the one who led the war also saw to the payment of the rights of the fisc, the payment of the rights of the fisc, right? Which consists of certain services of vehicles due from freedmen, and in general a certain judicial profit, of which I shall speak shortly. In other words, the vehicles. In other words, the freedmen had to give horses and chariots and things to the king's service, and that's it. And therefore, there was a kind of maintaining of it, and there was a profit that could be made in it, right from this. They didn't deliver; they had to give the money to it, right? They didn't have the necessity; they could have the money. The lords had the right to render justice in their fiefs, on the same principle that made the counts have the right to render justice in their county. And indeed, as different times brought changes, the counties always followed the changes following in the fiefs. Both were governed by the same plan and by the same idea. In a word, the counts were lords of their counties. Ludes, like, lords of their counties. And lords were counts of their lordships. Therefore, they mix both in terms of a military and civil obligation, right? And therefore, they had to render justice. The idea that counts were officers of justice and that dukes were military officers is not correct. Both were equally military and civil officers. It was necessary to undertake feud as well as friendships with their fathers and relatives. However, these feuds did not continue implacidly, since even a murder is expedited by a certain number of cattle and sheep, and the whole household receives with satisfaction tacitus, right? Ooh, is that 137? No, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry. Oops. Forgive me. Oops, back up, stop. We're not correct, right? Not correct. Both were equally military and civil officers. The whole difference was the Duke had several counts under him, though there were counts who had no dukes over them, as we learned from Friedrich 29. Right, this is from the Chronicles, right? One will perhaps believe that the government of the Franks was at the time very harsh, because the officers had simultaneously military power, civil power, and even fiscal power over the subject. A thing that I have said in the preceding books is one of the distinctive marks of despotism. So therefore, he had all those three things. Therefore, this would be like despotism, like any other thing, right? It must not be thought that the counts judged alone and rendered justice as do the pashas in Turkey. In order to judge suits, they held a kind of day court of assizes, to which the notables were convoked. So, therefore, 131, Malon de Brevetors. Okay, so therefore, it wasn't like they acted like the pasha in Turkey. So in order to judge, they had a kind of court of assizes. The notable people came to do this. To understand what concerns judgments in the formulas, in the laws of the barbarians and the capitories. I shall say that the functions of the count, of the graphia, and of the centauros were the same. That judges, the Rachtenbergi, and the Inchevs were the same persons under different names. So they were the same. They had different names, different things. That they were these were the adjutants of the count. So they had these. Okay, the functions of count, that of the grapha and the sentence, were the same, and the judges and the insha were also were the same, were the same person under different names. But these were adjutants of counts, and he usually had 7 of them. And as he had no fewer than 12 persons in order to judge, he filmed he filled out the number with notables. Right, this is 133. On the whole topic, see the capitries of Louis the Pious. And the formula of judgments given by the just at the beginning of the court, so at the beginning of the trial, they had 12. Notice this, they had this witness, this thing, and then fill the numbers out with the notables. Right, this is per bonum hamas, men qualified to act as witness or assessor in court. So this begins. The frank perception was that the count didn't just act as a pasha. He created a kind of board, a board to witness at. This was filled with his officials, but that was enough. He had to have 12 of them. He usually had 7, as he had no fewer than 12 persons in order to judge. So he needed to fill them out, which he had 7 of these underlings, these officers that they came, but then the rest of the things, five more had to come to get the 12, right? But whomever had the jurisdiction, whether king, count, greffier, censors, lords, or ecclesiastic, they never judged alone. And this usage, which had its origins in the forests of Germany, continued when their fiefs took new form. So therefore, this is right. The customs, it was this idea that they would get, they always, when they tried in, the person did not judge by himself. He was always done. He never judged alone. He did it in this idea of a group of people, witnesses, who participated in this. Right. As for fiscal power, it was such that the count could scarcely abuse it. The rights of the prince in this regard to freedmen were so simple that they consisted, as I've said, only as certain vehicles required on certain public occasions. And as for judicial rights, they were laws which prevented circumventions. So there's like this. Sorry. On chapter 19, on the settlement among the barbarian peoples. As it is impossible to inquire further into our political right. In other words, it's impossible to inquire further into our political right if one does not know perfectly the laws and mores of the German people. I shall pause for a moment to study. I should pause for a moment to pursue the study of their mores and their laws. So this is again long. This is going to be a long chapter, 18. I think this is the longest chapter. So therefore, the mores of the German is going to be the long chapter. As it appears in Tacitus, the Germans knew only 2 crimes, capital crimes. They hung traitors and drowned cowards. These were the only public crimes. So traitors, and they hung traitors and drowned cowards. When a man done something wrong to another, the relatives of the offended or injured person entered into the quarrel. The hatred was soothed by a satisfaction. That satisfaction concerned one who had been offended, if he could accept it, and and the relatives if the injured or the wrong was common to both, or if by the death of the one who had been offended or hurt, the satisfaction had devolved to him. Again, this is what it is necessary to undertake the feuds as well as the friendships of their fathers and relatives. However, these feuds did not continue implacidly, since the murderer is expiated by a certain number of cattle and sheep, and the whole household receives this with satisfaction. From Germanicus, right? This is Tacitus, right? Um, according to Tacitus, these satisfactions were made by reciprocal agreement between the parties. Thus, the codes of the barbarian peoples were satisfied by what is called sentiment. Why here Montesquieu defines compositions settlements, defines compositions of settlements, right? Okay. I find that only the laws of the Frisians left the people in a situation in which each enemy family was in the state of nature, so to speak, and in which, without restraint of any political or civil law, it could exact its vengeance according to its fancy until it was satisfied. So only this, the Frisians, 128 and 38, sorry, 138. But homicide, right? Even this law was tempered. It was established that one whose life was demanded would have peace in his house. In other words, his own house. That he would have it while going to and from church and to the place where judgments were rendered. So therefore, he would have peace. You couldn't be, in other words, even that, they can take endless things. He would not, in his home, you couldn't touch him in his home. You couldn't go into the church and from there to church or there to where to the place where judgment was rendered. The compilers of Salic law cite an old usage of the Franks, by which the one who had exhumed a corpse to despoil it was banished from society of men until the relatives consented to his return. And as before that time, all, even his wife, were forbidden to give him bread or to accept him in his house. Such a man, with respect to others, and the others were, with respect to him, in a state of nature until the state came to an end with the settlement. So unless the settlement was done, he was going to be exiled. In other words, it's kind of weird, this concept of these enemy in that sense. With these exceptions, one can see that the wise men of these various barbarian nations thought they themselves should do what was too slow and too dangerous to be expected from a reciprocal agreement of both parties. They were heedful to put a just price on the settlement that was to be accepted by one who had been injured or wronged. All the barbarian laws have an admirable precision on the subject. Cases are very distinguished. 141, right? Let's see, speed measuring titles 3 through 7 of the Salic law, right? Circumstances are weighed. The laws put itself in the place of the offended man and ask for him the satisfaction that in a cool moment he himself would have demanded. By the establishment of these laws, the German peoples came out of that state of nature in which it seems that they still were in the time of Tacitus. So they were still in the state of nature. They just had these codes, these agreements. Rothes declared in the laws of Lombard that he had increased the settlements for wounds over those of old customs, so that when wounded men were satisfied, enemies could cease. Indeed, among the Lombards, a poor people who had enriched themselves by the conquest of Italy, the old settlements had become frivolous, and reconciliation were no longer made. I do not, I do not doubt that this consideration obliged the other leaders of other conquering nations to make various codes of laws that we have today. There was restraints, punishments, and then, in other words, I doubt that this consideration obliged the other people. In other words, that the settlements became frivolous and therefore they weren't made anymore. Right? The principal settlements was that one that was the one that the murderer was to pay to the relatives of the dead man. Certain distances of these conditions made for distance a difference in settlement. Thus, in the laws of the Angles, the settlement was 600 souls for the death of an Alethean, 200 for that of a free man. In other words, this is like a lord, right? It's like this, and this is two. In other words, 600 was for the Alethean, 200 for that of a free man, and 30 for that of a serf or slave. Therefore, the size of the settlement established on the head of a man was one of the great prerogatives for, besides distinguishing his person, and established the greatest security for him among the violent nations. So if you killed him, you had to pay that much more. So 600 for an Atheling. This is the Angles, right? This is the laws of the Bavarians gave us a good sense of this. It gives the names of Bavarian families who accepted a double settlement because they were first families after the Erfelinge. Okay. The Erfelinge belonged to a ducal house. Yes, race, a ducal house, or resi. And the duke was chosen among them. They had a quadruple. These people had a quadruple set. Because they had double settlement. First, because the first families of this they belonged to the duke. The duke was chosen from among them, and they had a quadruple settlement. The settlement for the duke was a third more than that established for the Agrifier, because he is the duke. And the law said that he is given a greater honor than his relative, a third more than that of the Grand. All these settlements were fixed for a price of silver, but as these people, especially why they stayed in Germany, had scarcely any silver, they could give livestock, grain, furniture, weapons, dogs, hunting, birds, land, and so on forth. Thus, the law of India esteemed life in a certain sum of silver for a certain or a certain portion of land. Right. This is why he did this in essence. They can give these other goods. The law often even fixed the value of these things, which explains how, with a little silver, they had so many pecuniary penalties. So therefore, the law not only in terms of this, it just said that silver value, it would establish certain values of certain things tied to silver. So even if they had no little silver, they still had a mechanism of pecuniary penalties. Therefore, these laws sought to mark precisely the differences in wrongs, injuries, and crimes, in order for each man to know exactly to what degree he had wounded or offended, in order for him to know exactly the reparation he should accept, and above all, for him to know he should accept no more. In other words, you should do this. In other words, again, this is how much you need. Everything has been regulated by a price, and therefore, what you did, there's a certain price to it, the range of price, and that if they demand more, it's unjust. Okay, understand? There's a payment and there's a way to this. It's very libertarian, right? This is almost pseudo. This is. I understand why the libertarians might like this. Libertarian. Oh my God, this is like, oh God, I'm going to do this, right? This is almost like a. Well, okay, this is everything is tied to these, right? Except no more. From this point of view, one conceives that everyone who avenged himself after accepting the satisfaction committed a crime. This crime contained an offense against the public no less than an offense against the individual. It was scornful law itself. the legislature did not fail to punish this crime. Lex Lemur and the Capitularies of Charlemagne, containing an instruction given to those he sent into the provinces exile. Right? This is like, I'm going to do this. You can't be trusted. You didn't accept the things. You must accept what the law says. Must accept this. You did not commit. You refused to accept satisfaction, or you even after being satisfied, then you can punish, do something. Okay, no. There was another crime that was regarded as especially dangerous. When these people lost something of their spirit of independence, in other words, when these people lost something of their spirit of independence and civil government, and when the king applied themselves to putting a better police in the state, this crime was that of not wanting to give or accept satisfaction. So therefore, this idea, I will not give or accept satisfaction. In other words, what happened when the spirit of independence and civil government, when these people lost something of their spirit of independence and their civil government, and when the kings applied themselves to putting a better police in this condition of this people, we see in various law codes of the barbarians that the legislature made it an obligation to do so. In other words, that you needed to give satisfaction. Indeed, the one who refused to accept satisfaction wanted to preserve his right of vengeance. The one who refused to give it left his right of vengeance to the offended man. And this was what the wise people had reformed in the institution of the Germans. In other words, which invited the making of a settlement, but did not oblige one to do it. So therefore, in other words, it invited the making of a settlement, but did not oblige. But therefore, what happens is that you could do this way. The one who refused to accept the satisfaction wanted to preserve his right of vengeance. The one who refused to give it left the right of vengeance to the offended man. And that's it. I refuse to give this. That did this. So therefore, they gave the means which invited the making of a settlement, but did not oblige it. I have just mentioned texts of Salic law in which the legislature left it to the liberty of the one offended to accept or not to accept satisfaction. This law banned from the commerce of men anyone who had robbed a corpse into a relative accepting the satisfaction was asked that he might be live among them. Right? That's again from 51. The compilers of this seems to have modified this to some degree, right? Respect for holy things made those who drew up the Salic law change nothing of the former usage, right? Holy things made those who drew up the Salic law change nothing of them. It would have been unjust to grant a settlement to the robber relative of a settlement to the relatives of a robber killed in the act of robbery, or to the wife, or to those of a wife who had been sent back home after a separation for the crime of adultery. You're just not going to get a settlement because if you've been, I caught you in a robbery, you have no right to say that there's a wrong here because he committed a crime. He was robbing someone. He was killed. There's no right of a settlement. It's unjust to grant a settlement in this case. It was unjust to also do wife adultery. The laws of the beginning gave no settlement in cases like these, and it punished relatives who pursued vengeance for them. Okay, 52, and this is see the decree of Talcyon in this regard, right? It is not rare to find in the law codes of the barbarians settlements for involuntary actions. The laws of the Lombard is almost always sensible. In this case, it wanted one to settle in according with one's generosity, and and for relatives to be unable to pursue vengeance any longer. So therefore, you should do this 123. Again, this idea that Claudia too made a wise decree. He forbade the one who had been robbed to accept his settlement in secret and without the order of the judge. The motive for this law will slightly be seen. Chapter 20. On what has been no on what has been called the justice of the lords. Besides the settlement that was to pay relatives for murder, wrongs, and injuries, one had to also pay a certain right. A C note above P, which is a tax. In other words, a tax, a fine. That the law codes of the barbarians called freedmen. Freedom. 155. When the law did not determine it, it was ordinarily the third of what one gave for the settlement, as appeared in the Lex Lucanos, right? The Lex Lucanos. So therefore, this is for murders were wrong. It was a code, a law code for the barbarians called the freedom. So it had to pay a certain right. So not only the settlement, they also had to pay this price, right? I shall speak. I shall speak of it at length, and in order to give it to give an idea of it, I shall say that it is a compensation for the protection granted from the right of vengeance. Even today, frid means peace in Swedish. Frid, peace. This is the freedom. The freedom in this sense is we can say, oh, we're freedom, but also peace, right? This is a price that ensures peace in that sense. Among these violent nations, rendering justice was nothing other than granting to him who had committed an offense one's protection from the vengeance of him who had received it, and obliging the latter to accept the satisfaction that was his due, so that among the Germans, unlike all other peoples, justice was rendered to protect the criminal from the one whom he had offended. So therefore, it's interesting. Therefore, unlike other people, they're protecting the criminal. This is where the origin is, that idea that criminals have certain rights. It's a gift of the Germans in that sense, the Germanic tribes, the barbarians. The law codes of the barbarians gave us cases in which the frida, the peace, were to be levied. Okay, which frida, this is a price for peace. In those where relatives could not take vengeance, they gave no freedom. Indeed, where there was no vengeance, there could not be any right of protection from vengeance. Right? So there's no relatives, no vengeance. Thus, in the laws of Lombard, if someone unintentionally killed a freedman, he paid the value of the dead man without the freedom, because he had killed him unintentionally. It was not a case where a relative had a right of vengeance. Thus, in the laws of the Repudians, when a man was killed by a piece of wood or a thing made by hand, or the thing or the wood was considered to be guilty, and the relative took it for their own use without being able to exact a freedom. So, if it was something made, if it was a thing, in other words, a piece of wood or a thing made by hand, the thing or the wood would be considered, that would be guilty of this, be killed by that, and they would take it, and they would be without vengeance, and without to an act of freedom. Likewise, when a beast had killed a man, the same law established a settlement without freedom, because no offense had been committed against the relative of the dead man. Right? So there's no freedom in that sense. Finally, by civic law, a child under age of 12 who committed some infraction paid a settlement without freedom. Because they didn't have this thing of the freedom, which was kind of an extra price, right? As he could not yet bear arms, his was not a case for which injured party or his relative could seek vengeance. It was the guilty man who paid the freedom for the peace and security that he had lost because of the excess for the excess he had committed because of the excess he had committed, and that he could recover by protection. But a child did not lose his security. He was not a man. He could not be put outside the society of men. So therefore, this idea that you put out, in other words, being cast out from society. The punishment is that you cast out society. If you're going to be expired, you're going to be removed from society. Therefore, and you want to be kept in society, well, you have to get peace, prevent the vengeance of this. The freedom was a local right for the one who freedom was the local right for the one who judged in the territory. This appears by Decreto Christalis II. The freedus was reserved for the judge of that thing. So it's money that was collected by the judge. The law of repartience, however, prohibited his extracting it himself. So therefore, in other words, 161 is the Lucreti. The law wanted the party that had won to receive it and carry it to the fisc in order, so the law says, for peace to be eternal among the Repudians. So they'd get it, and then they bring it to the fisc. So therefore, this was the Repudians did not allow the judge to do it. Usually the judge excited himself, but now this one, the party would get it and then give it to the fisc. The size of the freedom is proportional to the size of the protection. In other words, capellas prenum incenere. It must be noted that what was called a freedom or freda in the documents of the Merovingians was called benenum in those of the Carolinians, as appears in the Capitures of Partus of the Saxons. Right? The size of freedom was proportional size of the protection. Thus, the freedom for protection by the king was larger than the one granted for protection by the count and the other judges. So, therefore, the amount of this, who's protecting? Who's doing the protecting? The king. That. In this, already I see the rise of justice to the lords. The fiefs included great territories, as is shown in the infinite number of records. I have already proven that kings placed no levy on the lands that were in the Frankishire. Still less they could reserve for them themselves rights on the fief. Those who obtained them had, in this respect, more extensive enjoyment of them. If the fiefs had, they drew all their fruits and their emoluments from them, those people. And the one of the most considerable was the judicial profit, fida, which was accepted according to the usage of the Franks. And it followed that the one who had the fief also had the justice, whose exercise was only in the settlement paid to the relatives and the profits owed to the Lord. The settlement was paid to the relatives, and any profit that was made was over. The justice was nothing other than the right to see that the settlement, in accord with the law, was paid, and to exact fines in accord with the law. Okay. So therefore, this is here Montesquieu defines the justice of the lords. Right? They had what. This is the justice of the law. Justice was nothing other than the right to see that the settlements were in accord with what the law were paid. The settlements were in accord with the law that were paid, and the fines, and exact fines according to what the law said. One sees that fiefs had this right in the formula that bears the confirmation or the transmission in perpetuity of a fife in favor of a lord or one of the faithful, or of the privileges of fief in favor of the churches, right? Yeah, and then this is that whole thing of that. This is again the notes to the source. This appears again in an infinity of charters prohibiting the judges and officers of the king from entering the territory to exercise any act of justice whatever, or to require any judicial numerate whatsoever. In other words, the judges, officers of the king cannot enter the territory. They cannot do this. This is 166. See the collection of these charters, especially the one at the end of the fifth volume of the history of the France Founding Fathers. As soon as the royal judges could no longer make any extractions in the district, they no longer enter the district, and and to those who the district remained performed the function of the royal judges. Royal judges are forbidden to oblige the parties to give securities in order to appear before them. Therefore, it was for the one who received the territory to exact them. So therefore, the securities were not, royal judges were not allowed to get securities. That the local judges they got security in that sense. And it is said that the king's deputy could no longer ask for largesse. Indeed, they no longer had any function here. So therefore, the judge. This is because they couldn't get money. They couldn't do this. They had no function of this local. Therefore, the justice was in the old fiefs and the new ones, a right inherent in the fief itself, a lucrative right that was part of it, the penalties and profit that could be made from the fee, of these freedoms and these things. This is why every age it had been regulated thus. This is why in every age has been regulated thus. Hence was born the principle that justice are patrimonial in France. It was tied to the baron. Justice is always seen as patrimony tied to the lord, tied to the local lord, tied to the local entity. Some have believed that, in other words, rather than the king. Okay, it was the local George, whereas the king, because because of the way the fight, and that they didn't want the kings to usurp the local entities, so therefore that's why the king's lords are not able to access penalties and do this. Some have believed that justice had their origins in the freeing of their serfs by the kings or lords, but the German nations and those descended from them are not the only ones who have freed slaves. Yet they are the only ones who have established justices that were patrimonial. In other words, justice was tied to the patrimonial ruler in that sense, the head of the court and the lord in that sense. The formula of Malkuth, moreover, show us freedmen dependent on these justices in early times. And he says, in particular, he says a line from the text of these sources, that in particular we order that public justice, approaching the men of the church and monasteries of Morbek, whether freedmen or slaves, or those who retain in their land. So give me the other thing. You had to rely on your own lord. Freedmen depended on justice in early times. Therefore, the serfs were under this justice because they were in the territory and they were not the and they were not the origins of the fief, or they were enveloped in the thief, and that they were not the origin of this fief, or that they were enveloped in it, that they lived in that territory. Others have taken a shorter route. They say that the lords usurp the justice, and that says everything. In other words, others have taken short. They say that the lords usurp the justice, and that says everything. But are the people who came here from Germany the only ones on earth who usurp rights of princes? History clearly teaches us that other people have made attempts against their sovereigns, but this has not been seen to give rise to what has been called justices of the lords. The origin should have been sought in the usages of the customs of the German. So therefore, this is we've seen this that conquering the people conquer things and take privilege. Well, there's other situations. They don't have the same situation. That it was left justice was left to the lords, not to the. I pray that one looks at the way of Lucia, Loisius, one of these Charles Lysias, the traits of justice in the village, right? The way Lucius assumes the laws proceeded to form and usurp the very judges. I pray that one looks at this guy, assuming the laws proceeded to form and usurp the very judges. They must have been the most subtle people in the world, and they must have stolen not as soldiers pillage, but as village judges and prosecutors steal from one another. He's saying, "Oh my God, these things." In other words, if this guy is correct, and it's not because they act as pillagers like this, but they're subtle and they're doing it the way judges and prosecutors steal from one another. One would have to say that these warriors, in all their particular provinces of their kingdoms, and in so many kingdoms, made a general political system. Luzra makes them reason as if he himself reasoned in his study. In other words, he's saying that, again, this is a case where he's saying that no, this emerged out of a very precarious situation, and the way the judges and the system has emerged out of the particular circumstances of the way the power, and that the idea that this was settled out of the conflicts of fights and the way the Germanic customs and wars were done, and that once you brought the king into it, this could threaten the system, and therefore this was why they maintained the rules. Right? It is not this idea that they did this because they were this was all conspiracy or this was a plot. In other words, they would have been the most settled people in the world. They weren't. They must have stolen not as judges. In other words, he says, um, um, no. I shall say again, um, if the justice were not a dependency of the fief, why can one see everywhere that the service of the fief was to serve the king or the lord, both in their courts and in their wars? This question mark's not in the French text. Okay, I understand that he's saying that here, but 169. Again, this is tied here. This is again here. Like this is the purpose of the fief. The justice is not dependent upon is was if justice were not dependent upon a fief, everywhere for the fief was to serve the king. So therefore, the king's justice had to be operated at the fief, had to be tied with the fief in this way. Even therefore, the exercising of the local lord, the count, in this thing had to exercise justice in this regard. Because if he didn't, then the system would break down. So therefore, this is the logic of this. And if the king usurped that, then he was usurping his own structure in that sense. Because the king was limited. In other words, the king created these because his power was not infinite. He couldn't unify. Like it wasn't like he was all powerful and he could control the whole thing. No, this was done because of a mechanism of limiting of his power. Right. So now let's look at number 21. We have 5 more chapters to go. So this is really teetingly long thing. So it's going to be long. I apologize. Chapter 21 on the territorial justice of the churches. The churches acquired a very considerable goods. We see that the kings gave them great fiscs, and that is great fiefs. And great fiscs, money, meaning money, sources of money. What is a fisc? And this is what? The public treasury of the Roman emperors, right? And this is great fiefs, which are, what is it? We find justice established at first in the domains of these churches. So the role is that okay, the church, the kings gave them great treasuries. That is, they're great fiefs in that sense. We find justice established at first in the domains of these churches. So justice is in fact laws, in this we're done. You may also hear of this sense, right? This idea of the church. What would have been the origin of such extraordinary privilege? Was it was in the nature of the thing given. Ecclesiastical goods had this privilege because it was not taken away from them. The fisc was given to the church, and it retained the prerogatives it would have had if one had given it to a lord, right? Thus, it was subject to the service that the state would have drawn from it if it had been granted to the laity, as had already been seen. So therefore, they would have had to been the same thing. Now they have to do. Since they may be exempt from granting, they might be exempt from granting war services, but there could be not justice, though, right? Therefore, the fief granted them. Once you had a fief, you were responsible to give service to the Lord, and that service was either to do justice, the king's justice. Therefore, churches had a right to the settlement paid in the territories and to exact the freedom in that sense, right? Anything judicial aspect of this that was done in the things to settle disputes among the population they had the right to, therefore, the money that they collected as the free. Not only they sell disputes without things, but then the freedom, the, the fine or the penalty that the guilty paid in order to secure peace, right? As these rights exact the freedom, and that these rights necessarily carried with them that of preventing the royal officers from entering the territory to extract these freedom in every exercise and from exercising any act of justice. The rights of the ecclesiastics to render justice in their territory was called immunity in the language of the formula, charters of capacity. So therefore, this is where immunity, the concept of immunity, 170. Again, this is the Marcuse formula. This is the where the concept of immunity emerged. Freedom. The judge that the emperor that this was personal rule, but now here because of the ecclesiasticals, they had the immunity from the king's activity. Right. This is where the immunity comes in there. Called the right to ecclesiastics to render justice in their territory was called this immunity. That's where immunity comes from. In the language of formulas and charters and capacitories. So this is where the word immunity came from. The power to exercise justice in that area, right? The laws of and that only they are. The king is not allowed to exercise that. The law of the repudians prohibits the freedmen. Laws of the repudian prohibit the freedmen of the churches from holding an assembly in which justice was rendered, except in the church they were freed. Were they freed? Except in the church they were freed. So the repudians nowhere except the church which they were freed, and they may seek justice. Right? They only there, and that's the whole point of this thing, right? Therefore, the churches had justice even over the freedmen, and held their audience from them from the earliest time of the monarchy. And that was the audiences in the D. Platide, the French word is the placide or the platide. So they're the plaids. Therefore, this is they held their audience. In other words, the freedmen were even they had to go there just in this situation. The only person they could turn to is the church. I find in the lives of the saints that Clovis gave a holy personage power over a territory of 6 leagues of the country, and that he wanted him to be free of any jurisdiction whatsoever. I believe that this is a falsehood, but it is a very old falsehood. The foundation for the life and the lie is related to the mores and laws of the time, and it is these mores and the laws that are sought here. 75. This is he talked about this again. Therefore, that it was a falsehood. This is the idea that he did this way. It's because why it's this falsehood is a foundation of the life of that time and of the lies that are related to the Moors and the laws of that time. Right? It is therefore the Moors and the laws we're sorting here. Clotaire II ordered the bishop or important men who possessed lands in distant countries to choose from a place itself those who were to render justice or to receive its emoluments. They had to pick a place, right? The same prince regulates the competence of judges of the church and those of his own officers. The bishops or the powerful who possess lands in other regions ought not to appoint as justice or commissioner those who are not from that place, to attend to and to render justice there. So in other words, that they were not to appoint justices those who are not from the foreigners. They weren't allowed to hide foreigners in that sense, right? That they to choose the place from which they were to render justice. They went to do foreign. The same prince regulates the competence of the judges of the church and those of his own officers. Right? They couldn't do it again in 77. This continues this principle here of 76. Charlemagne Capitory of 802 prescribes to the bishops and abbots the qualifications of their officers of justice should have. Another, by the same prince, forbid royal officers to exercise any jurisdiction over those who cultivate the ecclesiastic lands, unless the condition had been taken up fraudulently and in order to exempt from the public burdens. In other words, they did this fraudulently. In other words, you had no exercising, royal officers had no authority or jurisdiction in the world, ecclesiastic lands, unless those lands, this was not really properly done. It was done to avoid burden. The bishops assembled in Reims declared that the vassals of the church were within their immunity. Again, this is the servant and half free, those manumitted or under contract of old, and those of those renency. This is the question at the beginning of the laws to identify the location rather than to specify the evidence. So where's the location of this? And under 80, the 180, is it 180? Is it? That's it. I think it's 180. Yeah, 180. Of this episcopalian of Louisville, those estates and patrimonies where clerics live, and their persons are under the consecrated immunity, different from which military vassals are. So they have a different immunity. Charlemagne's capitary wanted the churches to have their own criminal and civil justice over all their territory. Finally, the capitary of Charles the Bald distinguishes between the jurisdiction of the king, those of the Lord, and those of the churches. And I shall say no more about them. So therefore, there's 318. The first of all, that is, the churches have justice over the lives who in and beside the church, and in its power and respect to life, by paying gold rather than suffering capital punishment, as well as to money and property. So therefore, this is those of the jurisdictions of the king, those of the Lord, and those of the churches. And I shall say no more about them, those jurisdictions. That the justices were established before the end of the reign of the Carolinians. Chapter 22. It has been said that it was time of the disorder under the Carolinians that the vassals abrogated justice to themselves within the fiefs, making a general proposition has been preferred to examining it. It has been easier to say that the vassal did not possess it than to discover how they possessed it. But the justices do not owe their origins to usurpation. In other words, they derive from the first establishment and not from the corruption. So in other words, The justices were not basically something that happened. They were there at the beginning, and then what happened was when they get corrupted, the things just fell apart, and they did. In other words, it has been a time of disorder that that the vassals abrogated the justice. It has been said that there was a time of disorder under Carolingian that the vassals abrogated themselves to within their fiefs, right? Making it that has been preferred. In other words, making a general proposition has been preferred to examining it, right? He says it has been easier to say that the vassals did not possess it than to discover how they possessed it, right? In other words, they didn't have it, right? But justice does not owe their origin to usurpations in that sense. They derive from the first establishment, not from the usurpation. He who kills a freedman, it is said in the laws of Bavarians, will pay the settlement to his relative if he has any. And if he has none, he will pay it to the duke or to someone who he has petitioned during his life. One knows that it was, one knows what it was to petition for a benefice. In other words, this was the idea of petition for a benefice. In other words, if you kill someone, you have to pay it. You have to pay that, and if not, you have to pay that. One knows what it was for a petition of benefits. The one whose slave had been taken, says the law of the Amini, will go to the prince to whom the abductor is subject in order to obtain a settlement. If a centuraris, it is said in the decree of Children, find a robber in another century than his own, or within the boundaries boundaries of our faithful, and does not drive him away, he will represent the robber, or will purge himself with an oath. Therefore, there was a difference between the territory of a centauri and that of a faithful. In other words, in which it was owned within the boundaries of a faithful, and does not drive him away. He will represent the robbers and will preserve his oath. In other words, there was a difference between the territory of the centauri and that of a faithful. This decree of Chobert explains the constitution of Clotaire of the same year, which, given for the same cause and about the same deed, differs only in terms, as the constitution called in trust, what the decree called in terminus filium in the border of our faithful. In other words, in trust, in that sense, became a border of our faithful. Madame Bigon and Monsieur Bigon and Monsieur de Clage, who believed that in trust meant the domain of another king, missed the mark. It was no. This was trust was in of our one who we of our someone who we have faith with, someone who we've given faith towards. Fides. In a constitution, in the constitution of Pippin, king of Italy, Pippin, king of Italy, made as much for the Franks as for the Lombards. This prince, after imposing penalties on the counts and other royal officers who betray their trust in the exercise of justice, or who delay in rendering it, orders that if a Frank or a Lombard who has a fief does not want to render justice, the judge of his district will suspend the exercise of his fief, and that in this interval the judge or his deputy will render justice. In other words, if he doesn't want to do it, if the fief does not want to do it, the person who's doing it, the Lord does not want to do this, then he's going to just take away the fief, suspend the fief, and until someone does get it, they will be either the judge or his deputy will render justice. A capitory of Charlemagne proves that the kings did not levy the frunda everywhere. Another from the same print shows that the feudal regulations and the feudal courts were already established. When he who has a fief does not render justice, or it keeps them from being rendered, another capitory from Louis the Pious wants one to have free quarters in his house until justice is rendered. So therefore, it's until someone is going to, until justice is rendered, they get free quarters out. I shall also cite two capitories of Charles the Bald, one from 861, in which particular jurisdictions are to be established with judges, and officers under them, and another from 864, in which he makes a distinction between his own lordship and those of individuals. So therefore, he says that there's a thing. He said, I have my own lordship and those of lordship of other individuals. He distinguishes this and has established judges that they must do, particular jurisdictions that are to be established with judges and officers under him, and it distinguishes between that and that distinction between his what happens in his. One sees one sees no original concession of fiefs because they were established by division known to have been made among the victors. Right. This is they were done. The fiefs were made. Therefore, one cannot prove by original contract that justice were attached to the fiefs at the beginning, but it was the formula of confirmations or transmissions in perpetuity of these fiefs that one finds, as has been said, that a justice was established. This right of justice had to be done, this right of justice had to have been of the nature of the fief and the one of its principal prerogatives. So therefore, remember, originally the fiefs were temporary. They were given and taken away by the crown. They were at the king's permission. Then it was given for jurisdiction. Then it was given perpetually. Once it's been given perpetually, then therefore all of a sudden the delivering of justice, this idea of delivering justice had to do it, and therefore the king had less control over it, because that if it didn't mean anything, if the king could do it, then it was how was this really a fief in that sense, right? How was it his territory in this territory? This is the patrimonial character. We have a greater number of records establishing the patrimonial justice of the churches in their territory than the ones proving the justice of the benefices of or fiefs of the lords or faithful, for two reasons. First, because most of the remaining records were preserved or collected by monks for the use of their monasteries. That's one reason. Second, because of the patrimony of the churches was formed by individual concessions and was a kind of derogation, exemption, right, or relaxation of a rule from an established order. There had to be charters for it, whereas the occasions, concessions made to the lords being consequences of political order, there was no need to have, and even less need to preserve a particular charter. In other words, these were done because of political reasons, and therefore, better not. This makes sense. There's no charters for these guys, stuff like that. Even the kings were often satisfied with simple transmissions of by scepters, as appears in the life of Saint Mir. So therefore, they were satisfied simple transmission of scepters. Transmission. This expressed tradition, meaning tradition in that sense, right? The scepters. But the third formula of market proves quite well to us that the privilege of immunity, and consequently that of the judges, that of the justice, were common to the ecclesiastical and secular men, and as it is made for both. It is the same in the Constitution of Leo II. 196, right? As a cited preceding a chapter of this thing. Chapter 23, the general idea of the book, an establishment of the Frank monastery in Gaul by a beat. This is a book review, right? As it is well, before finishing this book, for me to examine briefly the work of B. Du Bois, because my idea are perpetually contrary to his, and because he found out the truth. Because if he found out the truth, I have not. This work has seduced many people because it was written with much art, because what is in question is eternally assumed, because the more one lacks proof, the more one multiplies probabilities, because an infirmity of conjectures are set up as principles and other conjectures are drawn from these as consequences. The reader forgets that he has doubted and begins to believe. And as the endless erudition is placed, not on the system, but besides it, the spirit is distracted by secondary things and no longer concentrates on the principal one. So much research, moreover, does not permit one to imagine that nothing was found. The length of the voyage makes one believe one has finally arrived. But when one examines it closely, it appears to be an immense colossus with feet of clay. And it is because the feet are of clay that the colossus is immense. If the system of Abbe Dubois had a good foundation, he would not have been obliged to make 3 deadening volumes to prove it. He would have found everything in this subject, and without going to the ends of the earth to seek what was remote, reason itself would have taken up the charge of placing this truth in the chain of other truths. So again, he's criticizing Dubé, saying, listen, this thing is a monster, feet of clay, not bad foundations. This is why it has to be so huge. He has to go to everywhere instead of just going to the source itself. He had to go to remote thing of this. Reason itself would have been taken up the charge of placing this truth in the change of other truth. Right? History and our laws would have said to him, do not take so much trouble. We shall testify for you. So this is great. Short 3 paragraphs. Bang, bang, bang. Don't. Why are you going to all this trouble showing everything? Yeah, our laws would do it enough, right? Chapter 24. Continuation, same subject. A reflection of the foundation of the system. So this is a continuation of critique of Du Bois. Abbe Du Bois wants to remove any idea that the Franks entered Gaul as conquerors. According to him, our king, summoned by the peoples, did nothing but take the place and succeeded to the right of the Roman emperors. This claim cannot apply to the time when Clovis, entering Gaul, sacked and took the towns, nor can it be applied to the times when he defied Sigurus, a Roman officer, and conquered the country he held. Therefore, it can relate only to the time when Clovis, who had become master of a great part of Gaul by violence, would have been summoned by the choice and love of the people to dominate the rest of the country. And it is not enough for Clovis to have been accepted. He had to have been summoned. The Abbe Du Bois must prove that the people preferred living under the domination of Clovis to living under that of the Romans, or under their own laws. Now, the Romans, as part of Gaul, had not of Gaul that not had been yet invaded by the barbarians were 2 sorts, according to the Abbe Du Bois. Some were of the Armorican Federation and had driven out the officers of the emperor in order to defend themselves from the barbarians and govern themselves by their own laws. The others obeyed Roman officers. Now, does Abbe Du Bois prove that the Romans, who were still subject to the empire, summoned Clovis? Not at all. Does he prove that the republic of the Amorcians summoned Clovis and even made some treaties with him? Again, not at all. Far from his being able to tell us the fate of the republic, he cannot even demonstrate its existence. And although he follows it from the time of Honorius to the conquest of Clovis, although he relates to it all the events of these times with remarkable art, it remains invisible in the authors he cites. For these are considerable difference between proving it is a considerable difference between proving by a passage from Zosimus that under the empire of Honorius, the Omicarian religion and the other Gaelic province rebelled and formed a kind of republic, right? 97, right? 97, this of this, and in 98 is the entirety of Amorus and the provisions of the Gaul, right? This is from Zomers. Had shown and showing that despite Gaul's many publications, the Armorians always formed a particular republic that continued to exist until the conquest of Clovis. He would need very strong and exact proofs, however, to establish this system of this argument. For when one sees a conqueror entering a state and subject a great part of it by force and violence, and one sees shortly thereafter the whole state subjected, with histories telling nothing about how it happened, one has good reason to believe that the matter ended as it began. In other words, the matter ended as it began. It was not. It was conquered. It was conquered by someone else. It was not ordered. It has no state. They had to do some FF. Un tres yo suggest. Had good reason, right, to believe how it began. It is easy to see that once this point is missed, the whole of Abbe du Bois' system crumbles from the top to the bottom. And every time he draws some consequence from this principle, that Gauls was not conquered by the Franks, but the Franks were summoned by the Romans, one will always be able to deny it. Well, the Abbe du Bois proved his principles by the Roman ranks by which Clovis was invested. He wants Clovis to have succeeded Shidlik, his father, in the point of master of soldiery. But these two posts are purely of his own creation. The letter of Saint Remes to Clovis, on which he founds his principle, is nothing but a congratulatory note. Right, this is 199. Again, this is nothing more than a congratulatory note on his succession to the throne. When the purpose of writing is known, why not give it to one? Or when the purpose of writing is known, why give it one that is not? Right? It's congratulating to his throne. Why is it another thing? Clovis, near the end of his reign, was made consul by the emperor Anastasis. But what right could a simple 1 year authority give him? Right? It is likely, says Abbe du Bois, that the same document the emperor Anastasis made Clovis proconsul. And for myself, I shall say that it is likely that he did not, concerning a fact that is founded on nothing. The authority of the one who denies it is equal to the authority of the one who alleges it. That's a great line. In other words, given that this is, in other words, that's a great line. That is a great line. That concerning a fact that is founded on nothing, the authority of one who denies it, it is equal to the authority of the one who alleges it. All right, the great line in that sense. I even have a reason for this. Gregory of Tours, who speaks of the consulate, says nothing about a proconsulate. This proconsulate would have been only about 6 months. Clovis died a year and a half after being made consul. It is not possible to make a proconsul a hereditary post. Finally, when the consulate, and if one wants, the proconsulate, were given to him, he was already master of a monarchy and all his rights were established. Therefore, sorry, this was already done, this establishment was already. So, in fact, only 6 months, and this is not hereditary. Second proof alleged by the Abbe du Bois is the Emperor Justinian assignment to his children and his grandchildren of blood all the rights of dominion over Gauls. I could say a great deal about this assignment. Assign this assignment. One can judge its importance for the Frankish kings by the way they executed its conditions. The Frankish kings were moreover masters of Gaul. They were peaceful sovereigns. Justinian did not possess an inch of land there. The Western Empire had long been destroyed. The Eastern Emperor had a right over Gaul only as a representative of the Western Emperor. These were rights on top of rights. In other words, the Eastern Emperor only had empire authority over the Western Emperor, and that therefore the rights on top of right. The Frankish monarchy was already founded. The regulation of its establishment was complete. The reciprocal rights of person and that of the various nations living under the monarchy were agreed upon. The laws of each nation were given, and each were put into writing. What did this foreign assignment of rights do to an establishment already formed? It didn't do anything. In other words, what did this foreign assignment of rights do to an establishment already formed? In other words, this was established earlier. This was not. He had no authority to do so. This is a right on top of a right. Therefore, in that sense, what does the Abbe du Bois mean by referring to the oratory of the bishops, who, in disorder, confusion, and total collapse of the state, and the ravages of the conquest, sought to flatter the victor? What does flattery assume but the weakness of the one who is obliged to flatter? What do rhetoric and poetry prove but the very use of those arts, right? That proves those are flatter and very unrestrained art. Who would not be stunned to see Gregory Torres say, after speaking of the murders done by Clovis, that God humbled his enemies every day because he walked in his path? Who can doubt that the clergy were quite satisfied with Clovis's conversion and that they even found great advantage in it? But at that same time, who can doubt that the people suffered all the misfortunes of the conquest and that the Roman government yielded to the German government? The Franks did not want and were not even able to change anything. Few victors indeed have had this mania, changing everything. In other words, you don't change everything. They can't change everything. They just don't have the mania. Few victors have this mania. But in order for all the consequences of Abbe du Bois to be true, they would have had not only to change nothing among the Romans, but also had to change themselves. So therefore, nothing changes, therefore, but they have to change nothing of the Roman, but change everything with yourself. No, that's going to be, it's very difficult for conquerors to change anything, including yourself. They usually carry the same behavior over it. I might undertake to prove in the same way, following the method of Abbe du Bois, that the Greeks did not conquer Persia. First, I would speak of the treaties that some of the towns made with the Persians. I would mention the Greeks were the pay of the Persians, as the Franks were in the pay of the Romans. As for Alexander entered the country of the Persians, besieged, took and destroyed the town of Tyre, it was a particular business like that of the Sagariatus. But see how the high priest of the Jews come to meet him. Listen to the oracle of Juniper Ammon. Remember what had been predicted at Gordium. See all the towns run out, so to speak, to meet him. See the satraps and the important men crowd forward. He is dressed in the Persian manner. It is the consular robe of Clovis. It is the consular robe of Clovis. Does not Darius offer him half his kingdom? Is Darius not killed as a tyrant? Do not the mothers and the wife of Darius mourn the death of Alexander? Were Quintus, Curtius, Arrian, and Plutarch Alexander's contemporaries? Was- Could this guy Quintavis, Arian, and Plutarch, these contemporaries, had not printing even given us the had not printing given us the enlightenment that these authors lacked? In other words, this is, again, Du Bois, right? This is the entire story of the establishment of the monarchy of the Gauls. Okay, so he just does this massive, just mockery of Du Bois's thing, and saying, "Well, what he says about Clovis, I can say about Alexander and the Persians." Fantastic. This is the last chapter, chapter 25. On the Abbe de Bois from the French nobility, right? This sums up the thing, the French nobility. The Abbe de Bois maintains that in the early times of our monarchy, there was but one order of citizens among the Franks. This claim, insulting to the blood of our first families, would be no less harmful to the three great houses that have reigned over us in turn. If it were so, the origins of their greatness would not go back to be lost in oblivion and darkness and in time. History would illuminate the centuries in which they would have been common families in the order in order of Chilperic, Pippin, and Hugh Capet to be gentlemen. One would have to seek their origins among the Romans or the Saxons, that is, among the subjected nations. The Abbe de Bois found his opinion on the Salic law. This law makes it clear, he says, that there were not two orders of citizens among the Franks. The law gave 200 sous for the death of any Frank whatsoever, but it distinguished among the Romans between the king companions whose death it gave 300 sous in settlement, and the Roman proprietor to whom it gave 100, and the Roman tributary to whom it gave only 45. Pardon, hiccup. And the difference in the settlement was the principal distinction, he concludes, that there was only one order of citizen among the Franks and three among the Romans. It is surprising that this error should not itself have made him discover his error. Indeed, it would have been quite extraordinary for the noble Romans who lived under the dominions of the Franks to have a larger settlement and to have more important personage than the most illustrious Franks and their great captains. What likelihood is there that the victorious people would have had so little respect for themselves and so much for the vanquished people? In addition, Abbe de Bois cites the laws of other barbaric nations, which prove that there were different orders among citizens, different orders of citizens among them. It would be quite extraordinary if precisely this general rule had been absent among the Franks. This should have made him think that he had misunderstood or had wrongly applied the text of the Salic law, which is indeed what happened. One can find on opening this law that the settlements for death of an etruscan, death of etruscan, that is, of a faithful or vassal of the king, was 600 sous, and that the one for the death of a Roman, a companion and king, was only 300. One finds in it the settlement that the death of a simple Frank was 200 sous, and that for the Roman, and that the one for the Roman in the ordinary condition was 100. One paid also for the death of a tributary of Rome, a kind of serf or freedman, the settlement for 45 sous. But I shall not speak of this, or of the one for the death of the Frankish serf or the Frankish freedman. It is not a question here of this third order of persons. What does the Abbe du Bois do? He does not mention the first order of persons among the Franks, that is, the article concerning the Etruscans, and then comparing the ordinary Frank, whose death of 200 sols in settlement was paid with the one he calls the three order among the Romans, and those and for those whose debts concerning settlements were paid. He finds that there was but a single order of citizens among the Franks and three among the Romans. As according to him, according to him, there was but a single order of persons among the Franks. It would have been well for there to have been only one among the Burgundians, because their kingdom formed one of the principal parts of our monarchy. But in their codes, there were three sorts of settlements: one for the Burgundians, or Roman nobles, another for the Burgundians, or Roman of middling condition, and the third for those of the lower conditions of the two nations. The Abbé has not cited this law. It is singular to see how he escapes from these passages that press him from every side. Now, 310, this is like, he mentions, this is that famous. One does not speak, does one speak to him of important men, of lords or nobles? These, he says, are simply distinctions and not distinctions of order. They are things of courtesy and not prerogatives in the law. Or else he says that these people spoken of were the king's council. They could even be Romans. But still, there was a single order of citizens among the Franks. On the other hand, if some Frank or some lower, if some Frank of a lower order mentioned, he is a serf. He has interpreted the decree of Childeric in saying, he interprets the decree of Childeric in this way. It is necessary for me to pause a bit over this decree. The Abbé du Bois has made it well known because he has used it to prove two things. One, that all the settlements are to be found in the laws of the barbarians were but of civil interests, were but civil interests added to corporal penalties, which altogether reverses all the old records. And the other, all freedmen were judged directly and immediately by the king, which is contradicted by the infinity of passages of authorities that were made known had known to us the judicial orders of those times. So, in other words, this is like wonders, and that this is okay. He's just totally just said, okay, oh no, sorry, the boys, this is really wrong. He's ignoring this, he's ignoring that, he's ignoring this. It is said that this decree made by the assembly of the nation, that if the judge finds a well-known robber, he will have him bound and sent before the king, if he is a Frank. But if he is a weaker person, de blow persona, a Franco, he will be hanged on the spot. It is decreed that this has been agreed to Conan, so we commanded that whoever judges gives heed to a criminal robber who walks in his house and makes bond with him. If this one be a Frank, let him be brought to our presence. If he be a lesser person, let him be hanged on the spot. Right? According to Abbé Du Bois, Francus is a freedman. De blow persona is a serf. I shall set aside for a moment the question of what the word Francus can mean here, and I shall begin by examining what one can understand by these words, a weaker person. I shall say, in whatever language it may be, any comparative assumes there's necessarily three terms: lesser, a greater, a lesser, and the least. If it were if it were here a question only of freedmen and serfs, one would have said a serf, and not a man of lesser power. Thus, debilito persona does not here does not here mean a serf at all, but a person who have must have a serf beneath him. This assumed Francus will not mean a freedman, but a powerful man. And Francus here is taken here in this exception, because among the Franks they were those whom they were always those who held greater power in the state and who were more difficult for the judge or the count to correct. As powerful was this person who's a Francus, so it's powerful in that sense. This explanation agrees with a great number of caputaries, these creeds in that sense, which gives the instance in which criminals could be referred to the king and those which could not. Right? See book 28, chapter 28, and book 31, chapter 8 of this work. Right? One finds in the life of Louis the Pious, written by Thugian, that the bishops, especially those who had been serfs and those who had been born under the barbarians, were the principal authors of the humbling of the emperor. Thugian reproaches Hebron, whom this prince had taken out of servitude and made archbishop of Rheims. Thus, what a reward the emperor has received for so many good deeds. He made you free and not noble. He could not make you noble after giving you He could not make you noble after giving you liberty. So this is 120. What a repayment you return. He made you free, not noble, since this was impossible after freeing you. He freed you. This is like this. Hebron, the Archbishop of Rheims, would have been of the first order, higher than that of the nobility. I leave the reader to decide whether this passage does not mean that. I leave it to the reader to decide if this passage does not mean that. I leave him to judge if it is here a question of priority of clergy over nobility. This passage only proves only, continues Abbe Du Bois, that the citizens born free were called noblemen. In the usage of the word nobleman and man born free have long meant the same thing. What? From the fact that in our modern times some of the bourgeoisie has townsmen, right? The townsmen, the bourgeoisie, have styled themselves noblemen. The passage in the life of Louis the Pious will be applied to these kinds of people. Perhaps also, he goes on to say, Hebron was not a slave in the Frankish nation, but in the Saxon nation or some other Germanic nation where the citizens were divided into several orders. Because of perhaps of the Abbe Du Bois, there was no nobles in the Frankish nation. But he has never more wrongly applied a perhaps. One had just seen that Thugian distinguishes among the bishops who had been opposed to Louis the Pious, some who had been serfs and some who had come from barbarian nations. Hebron belonged to the first group and not the second. I do not know how one can say, moreover, that a serf such as Hebron could have been a Saxon or a German. A serf has no family and consequently no nation. Louis the Pious freed Hebron and freed serfs, and as the freed serfs took the law of their masters, Hebron became a Frank. and not a Saxon or a German. I have just made my attack. I must defend myself. One will tell me that the body of the Antrusticians were formed in order in the state distinct from that of freedmen, but that, as fiefs were inalienable at first, given the perpetuity of the latter, this could not form a nobility by descent, since these prerogatives were not at all attached to the hereditary fief. It is this objection that doubtless made Monsieur de Vaux think that there was but a single order of citizens among the Franks, a feeling that Abbe du Bois took from him, and he and which he has absolutely ruined with his bad proofs. Be that as it may, it is not the Abbe du Bois who could have risen this objection. For having given three orders of Roman nobility and styled the first guests at the king and styled the first guest at the king's table, he could not have said that this title marked a nobility by descent more than did that of an Etruscan. But a direct reply is necessary. An Etruscan or a faithful were not such because they had a fief, but because they were given feasts because they were Etruscans or faithful. One will recall what I have said in the early chapter of this book. Therefore, they did not have the same fief they later had. But if they did not have that one, they had another. And because fiefs were given at birth, because they were often given in assemblies of the nation, and finally, because it was in the interest of the nobles to have them, it was also in the interest of the king to give them. These families were distinguished by their ranks as the faithful, and prerogatives as being able to petition for a fief. I shall show in the following book, and that is, book 1, book 31, chapter 3, last book, 23, right? How the circumstances of those times, they were freedmen who were admitted to the enjoyment of this great prerogative, and consequently remitted entry into the order of nobility. It was not thus in the times of Guntram and Childberda, his nephew, and it was thus in the time of Charlemagne. So it was not that. In other words, freedmen were not allowed to do it. Though, from the time of this prince, freedmen were not disqualified from possessing fiefs. It appears by the previous cited passage of Slither that freed serfs were absolutely excluded from it. And the Abbe du Bois, who goes to Turkey to give us an idea of what the old French nobility was like, tells us that anyone has ever complained. In other words, tells us that anyone has ever complained in Turkey that people of common birth were rise to honors and ranks, and complained under the reigns of Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald. No one complained in the time of the Charlemagne, because this prince always distinguished between the old families and the new ones, which Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald did not. Right? In other words, Charlemagne distinguished it; they did not. The public should not forget that it is indebted to Abbe du Bois for a number of excellent compositions. It is on these fine works that I should judge him, and not on this one. The Abbe du Bois has fallen here in a grave error, because he had the Count of Boulevilliers more in view than his subjects. In other words, this Count. I shall draw from all my criticisms, but this reflection: if this great man has erred, what should what should what should I not fear? So therefore, that's another thing.
It was that this man could err, this person who did all these great works. How, uh, what should I fear? The man could err. So it's criticism that maybe I should fear that I made the errors too. Right? This is another thing. So therefore, this is an interesting ending. This ends the book. And this has been a long reading. I got a feeling it's going to be over 2 hours. I hope not. That's it. Any comments or criticism, comments or questions or things, please put them below. If you've liked it, like it, share it with a friend, encourage it. That's good because I know the last video was like, oh, let's try and go 4 hours. Oh my God, die. Again, this is the book. Sorry, not the last chapter, but the one before that. Okay, last one was shorter, but it was still an hour or something. If you liked it, again, I said like it like that. If you didn't like it, well, say why. And you can hit the downward thumb, but say why in the comments, and maybe we can learn from it. It's too long, done for them. I understand. Okay. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe so you get the notifications of the new videos coming up. You can follow me on social media below. Most of my academic links are kind of links to my academic credit, who I am and what I do, are below as well. If you want to help me doing what I do, want to contribute to it, you can do so. Become a Patreon or subscribe star. Another thing you can do is, oh, but you don't do anything. Okay, yeah, but you just want to help. You want another way you can help is you can, a PayPal or something like that. You can find my address out and you can do it. Another thing you can do is you can buy my books. If you want to help, contribute my books. Like I said below, the Lulu book is the best way I do it because that's the more I get the money directly from that. So that's it. Again, you have one more video left, and that will be done on Wednesday. It's coming Wednesday. Schmidt will be finishing up this week as well. So therefore, that's it. Well, take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.